Welcome. Tonight you're invited to drift far backward through time, past the flicker of candles and the murmur of Latin prayers, before chariots rattled across Roman stone roads or the first chimney warmed an English cottage. We're heading into the cold fog of the early medieval world, to a time often called the Dark Ages. But dark doesn't just refer to the absence of Rome's books and roads. It was dark in the literal sense too. Windowless homes, smoke-thick halls, long winters when the sun barely broke through the clouds. The kind of world where your only alarm clock was the ache in your joints and the banging of metal from the next hut. Tonight, we'll walk in the soot-covered footsteps of one of the most physically battered and socially overlooked members of that world, the Saxon metalworker. You might think of swords and glory, but the reality is more ash in your mouth than honor on your name. This journey won't just rest by the forge. We'll explore the mysterious burial of Sutton Hoo. We'll wander through blackened bog pits, search for lost runes in discarded slag heaps, and feast beside lords who never had to swing a hammer in their lives. From grizzled apprentices with blackened fingernails to elite chieftains weighed down by rings and secrets. This is a quiet and smoky journey into a world built on fire, but mostly lived in silence. Now breathe slowly, let the embers glow in your mind, let the hammering fade to rhythm, and imagine yourself waking in a hut of timber and mud, on a bed of straw stiff with the scent of old smoke, with the taste of copper lingering on your tongue. Let us begin. Chapter 1. Hammering bronze with bare arms and ashen eyes. The day begins before the sun. There's no rooster, no chiming bell tower, only the clatter of cold winds scratching against the gaps in the timber walls. You lie on your back, straw poking your skin, the itch of soot caked into your scalp. Your breath curls upward into the frozen air, white and useless. Somewhere across the village, a dog barks. Or perhaps it's a wolf. At this hour, in this season, it's hard to tell the difference. You pull yourself up from the bedding and fumble for your tunic, stiff with old sweat and blackened with smoke from yesterday's work. There's no such thing as a clean in a Saxon metalworker's life, only degrees of filth. A splash of freezing water from a wooden bucket is all you'll get to wash away the crust of ash clinging to your arms. Outside, the earth crunches underfoot. Not snow, just frost thick enough to feel like glass. You trudge toward the forge, a simple shelter of stone and timber sunk low to hold in the heat. The door hangs crooked and your breath catches as you step inside. It's warmer than outside, but just barely. The forge hasn't been lit yet. That's your job. You kneel, coaxing damp reeds and dry twigs into a flame with a flint that sparks stubbornly, like it resents the morning as much as you do. There's no romantic blaze, no roaring inferno, just a hiss and flicker as the embers awaken. It smells of damp bark, sour charcoal, and the metallic sting of yesterday's sweat. The tools are simple and heavy. A hammer worn smooth from years of striking, a pair of tongs bent from being dropped one too many times, and the anvil pitted and scorched like it's seen every war the Saxons ever fought. And maybe it has, because unlike warriors or kings, the anvil never dies. There is no breakfast yet, not until the iron is hot. Your first task is to melt down a heap of bronze scraps, scavenged from broken brooches, shattered blade bits, and offerings traded from nearby villages. Metal is precious, not because it's rare, but because it's so hard to shape without breaking yourself in the process. The work is brutal. You pump the bellows, arms trembling, until your forearms burn. The fire hisses louder. You place a chunk of copper into the crucible, then add a smaller portion of tin. Careful, now, too much, and the bronze will be brittle, too little, and it won't pour right. You watch it melt, bubbling slowly like thick stew until it's ready to be cast. There's no mold for anything extravagant. Today it's arrowheads and hinges. Nothing glorious, nothing that earns a song. Just the dull necessities that hold doors together and keep raiders at bay. You pour the molten bronze into a carved sand mold, fingers trembling from the heat radiating up through the stone table. One wrong move, one twitch, and you'll be burned for weeks. That's not poetic exaggeration. That's reality. And the Saxons had no ointments or real medicine for it. You simply wrapped it and hoped it didn't fester. When the castings cool, you chip away the sand, revealing dull gray shapes that need endless filing. You work them over with the rasp, then hammer out the edges. There's rhythm to a clang, scrape, tap, hiss, like music if music were painful. By now, your stomach gnaws. You break from your work to chew on a chunk of barley bread as hard as a brick. It tastes like smoke and salt. There's a smear of goat cheese if you're lucky, but more often it's just crumbs and sour ale. The bread is old. Everything is old. The only thing new in your world is the fire. Around midday, the forge fills with smoke so thick your eyes sting. You pause, wipe your forehead, and glance outside. There's a boy waiting no more than 10 with a broken blade. His father's, most likely. You nod, take it from him, and examine the jagged edge. The boy doesn't speak. He just waits barefoot on frost as you place the weapon onto the coals. By evening, your arms are lead. Your ears ring from the hammering. Your clothes are stiff with sweat, and your throat is raw from smoke. But the work isn't done. There are nails to finish and a bit of forge. There's no end to it. No holidays. No peace. Just fire and labor. The nights are silent except for the creak of the forge cooling and your own joints groaning as you curl into sleep. Ash coats your nostrils. You smell like earth and fire. In the Saxon world, no one sings for the metalworker. But every sword that earns a song started here, in the dark, with bare arms and ashen eyes. The afternoon draws on with the sluggish crawl of smoke through rafters darkened from years of burning. There is no clock, no ringing bell, only the angle of the sun outside. Slanting down across a splintered bench, you do not see many coins. Most transactions are barter eggs, wool, sometimes a hen if the item is big enough. The light slants low across the anvil, turning its battered surface into something almost sacred. It's damp and heavy, but it will burn hot once dried. You nod without speaking. He knows to strip the bark and stack it near the hearth. His hands are blistered. His knuckles raw, but he says nothing. Neither do you. No one taught you this trade with books or lectures. No street lamps, no distant engines. Just the whisper of wind and the occasional cry of something wild in the distance. Your home is barely more than a lean-to, but it holds out most of the wind. You lie down again, now in fresher straw, and pull a rough wool blanket across your chest. The fabric scratches, but it holds in your warmth. Your fingers twitch from the day's work, aching in the joints and stained a permanent gray. You close your eyes and see the glow of fire still behind your eyelids. It never really fades. You learned it the same way he will, by failing, by burning yourself, by watching and doing and bleeding. Just for a moment of the life you might have lived if you'd been born into a family of weavers or shepherds. But then again, everyone in this age suffers in their own way. The world is hard, not in sudden, sharp ways. But in constant grinding ones, you don't dream often. When you do, it's usually about something simple, clear water, clean air, a morning without pain. Those dreams fade fast. The reality always wakes first. You once dropped a crucible as a boy. It shattered, and molten bronze spilled across your foot. You're not a hero or a villain or a name in a scroll. You're just one man among many, sweating beside fire, shaping the tools others will use to change the world. You won't be remembered, but the metal you forged might last a century. That is your legacy. And tomorrow it starts again. You screamed, then passed out. You limped for months. A scar is still there, puckered and pale. A quiet reminder that fire does not forgive carelessness. This is the closest thing you have to a chapel. Your hands move without thinking, like the motion has been carved into your bones. The blade edge gleams in the fading light. Not bright like silver or gold, but clean, honest. There's no trickery in a well-made edge. You've heard stories of smiths who could fold iron so fine it sang when struck. You've never met one. Maybe they live in the South, or in books you can't read. You don't even know how to sign your own name. The fire flickers like stained glass might in a cathedral. But instead of saints, your walls are lined with rust and broken blades. You eat it slowly, the warmth rising into your face, and for a brief moment, the world feels quiet. Not peaceful, but less sharp. The ache in your arms dulls. You drink weak ale, gritty with sediment, and it settles the dryness in your throat. The apprentice says nothing, but he eats beside you, his eyes flicking toward the coals, perhaps wondering if this is the best his life will ever be. You wonder too, but you learn not to ask questions that can't be answered. The smoke that rises could almost be incense, if you squint and forget the sting in your eyes. Sometimes you talk to the anvil. Every rasp, every tong, every hammer is wiped, checked, and placed back into its worn groove. A careless tool is a dangerous one. You've seen men lose fingers to their own sloppiness. A slip of iron, a wobble in the hand, and that's it. The forge does not wait for you to heal. The work must go on, always on. Not aloud, not really, but in your head. You ask it to hold steady, to carry the weight. Because if it gives way, you're finished. There are no spare anvils, no replacements. Everything in your life is singular, precious, and barely held together. There are no contracts, just nods and callous handshakes, and the mutual understanding that fire and iron don't lie. You mend a farming hook for an old man who lost 2 fingers to frostbite, and he leaves you a tattered bundle of smoked fish that smells like the sea and soot. You'll eat it anyway. Hunger isn't particular in the dark ages, and the long shadows of tools leaning like weary soldiers against the wall. You stretch your back, the muscles in your shoulders pulling tight like twisted rope, and reach again for the rasp. There's no comfort in this work, only habit, only rhythm, clang, scrape, breathe. The metal takes shape because it must, not because anyone cares how it looks. Perfection isn't the goal. Function is. If the hinge holds the gate or the point pierces cloth, it is good enough. Nothing in the Saxon forge is made to be beautiful. Beautiful things are for kings and priests, not for men like you. Occasionally, a traveler passes through and offers a silver coin for repair or a crude tool. As twilight arrives, the forge turns golden red. One of the apprentices returns from the woods dragging a branch of alder. Later, when the forge dims and the heat fades into tired shadows, you sit on the floor and sharpen tools for the next day. Supper is a bowl of lentils and wild herbs boiled in a dented pot that hangs crooked over coals. When the meal is done, you clean the tools again. Night comes quietly. You think, in the end, Chapter 2, The Burial of Sutton Hoo. The morning mist clings low to the ground like a shroud, curling around tufts of grass and uneven mounds that rise strangely from the earth. The soil here feels old, even to those who don't know what lies beneath it. No paths are worn into the dirt. No stones mark any graves. Just gentle humps in the landscape, like the land itself is breathing slowly under layers of time. Sutton Hoo, a place where the past rests barely covered. And somewhere in the early 7th century, it became the unlikely stage for one of the most significant funerals in Anglo-Saxon history. A ritual so grand it was nearly forgotten for 1,000 years, buried as deeply as the man it honored. We don't know exactly who he was. The name most often whispered is that of King Riedwald of East Anglia, a leader who straddled pagan traditions and Christian influences like a man standing in 2 worlds at once. But in truth, we can't say for certain. What we do know is this: someone powerful died. And those left behind believed he deserved to sail into the afterlife, not with a whisper, but with the clang of gold against iron, with armor strapped to a wooden hull buried deep in the soil. He would not simply fade. He would be planted like a seed of glory beneath the earth. Imagine the scene. The ship 90 feet long-hauled from the River Deben, dragged laboriously over logs and mud by dozens of men. No sails needed now. Its final voyage would be overland, pulled like a stubborn ghost resisting its own end. The hull creaked under its own weight as it was laid gently into a trench, carved deep into the hillside. This was not a ship for water anymore. It was a vessel for memory. Then came the offerings. Not humble tokens or simple mementos. Treasures. A helmet gleaming with polished bronze and inlaid with garnet, shaped like a snarling face. Sword hilts wrapped in gold, their leather grips still dark with the oils of past battles. A shield so wide and finely worked it looked ceremonial, though it had likely seen real blood. Buckets of silver bowls, spoons carved with strange symbols, drinking horns tipped with intricate metalwork. The grave was not just a tomb. It was a museum, a hall of kings. And yet, oddly, no bones would remain. That's the part that puzzles archaeologists even now. When the mound was finally excavated in 1939, just weeks before war would once again sweep across Europe, they found the impressions of the timbers, the pattern of the planks, and the layout of every object. But no human remains. Only a ghostly shape in the acidic sand where the body had once lain, gone, dissolved, as if the earth had swallowed him completely. Some say the acidity of the soil simply erased him. Others wonder if he was never placed there at all. A symbolic burial, perhaps. A cenotaph. A message to gods and men alike. But let's return to that 7th century morning. To the moment before the earth was filled in. The ship sat in the ground like a creature sleeping. The treasures gleamed faintly in the low sun. A few scattered petals drifted down from a branch above. No flowers were arranged, but nature contributed what it could. The mourners stood in a ring, silent. There were no trumpets, no choirs. Only the steady breath of the wind and the soft crackle of a torch lit for ritual burning. Though this was not a cremation, fire still had its place in Saxon farewell. Perhaps they burned offerings nearby. Perhaps they simply kept the flames alive to guide the soul's journey west. And then the earth returned, shovelful by shovelful, until the ship was no longer visible, until the treasures were tucked beneath the surface, until only the mound remained, rounded and silent, like a pause in the hills, no marker, no runestone, just the trust that memory would hold. For centuries, it did not. The site faded from stories, overgrown and ignored. Locals called it a place of ghosts, but never dug deep. It wasn't until a curious landowner named Edith Pretty hired an excavator named Basil Brown that the sleeping giant was stirred again. What they found was not only the ship, but a link across time. A reminder that even in a period often painted with gloom and ignorance, there had been splendor, intelligence, craft, a knowledge of death as more than an end. Because the burial at Sutton Hoo wasn't about despair. It was about legacy. About making sure that whoever lay beneath that soil would not vanish entirely. About building a fortress of iron, gold, and wood around a memory, and hoping that, centuries later, someone might still care to wonder. You can almost see the hill now, can't you? In your mind's eye, gently rising, still, quiet, the sun low behind it. Not a monument to glory, but to the strange tenderness of remembrance. The idea that someone once was loved enough to be buried like a legend. Even if their name would someday be lost, the mound slept on for over 1,000 years, unbothered by the passing of kings and the thundering of armies. The world changed all around it. Empires rose and fell. Cathedrals stretched toward the sky. Engines replaced who's, and telegrams replaced town criers. But beneath the earth at Sutton Hoo, the ship and its treasures waited in the dark, not preserved in gold or stone, but impressed into the earth like the fossil of a forgotten heartbeat. By the time the 1930s arrived, the burial mound looked like any other small rise in the Suffolk countryside, just another quiet wrinkle in the landscape. And yet, something about it tugged at Edith Pretty. She lived nearby, a widow with a curious mind and a quiet presence. A woman not easily dismissed, though not one to chase fantasies either. Something about the hill, perhaps the way it always caught the morning light, or how the animals avoided walking over it, stayed with her. There had always been rumors. Local children said mounds were haunted. Older folk spoke of buried kings and forgotten treasure, but always with a laugh at the end. No one ever dug. It seemed somehow impolite, as if disturbing the hill would wake something better, left sleeping. But Edith couldn't let it go. She hired Basil Brown, a local man without formal training, but with dirt under his nails and a lifetime of watching the land. He wasn't the kind of archaeologist that universities invited to speak. He was the kind who felt the difference between old earth and new by the pressure of his boot. He began to dig in 1938, slowly, carefully, scraping away layers of soil with the delicacy of someone peeling an onion that might explode. The early trenches revealed a few pottery shards, some rivets, and the outline of wooden planks. Interesting, but nothing extraordinary. Not yet. Then came the summer of 1939. The war loomed, though no bombs had yet fallen. Brown returned to the largest of the mounds, the one that had always seemed just a little too symmetrical to be natural. As he dug deeper, the soil began to change. It darkened in long, thin lines, running parallel like ribs. He realized he wasn't just uncovering debris. He was tracing the ghost of a ship. A full-sized burial ship, buried intact beneath centuries of earth. The timbers had rotted away, eaten by time and soil, but the impression remained, like a photograph developed in dirt. Then the treasures began to appear. A twisted hilt wrapped in gold, buckles etched with tiny, interlocking beasts, shoulder clasps that gleamed even under the dust. A pattern began to form. This wasn't just a burial, it was a royal display. A performance of status and mythology meant to last forever. And in a way it had. The grave was undisturbed, unlooted, untouched. A rarity so astonishing that it attracted the attention of national museums and crown officials in a matter of days. Scholars arrived in press suits, frowning at the soil while wiping their glasses. The British Museum sent curators. The press caught wind, and suddenly the sleepy fields of Sutton Hoo became a quiet whirlwind of debate, and Brown was pushed aside for more credentialed hands, though his work remained the backbone of the entire discovery. As the artifacts emerged, each one more exquisite than the last, it became clear that this was no mere nobleman's resting place. This was a king's tomb, a Saxon pharaoh's chamber hidden beneath English grass. And still there was no body. The central burial chamber was precisely shaped, lined with rich goods, and bore all the marks of a high-status interment. But no bones, no teeth, no trace of the man himself, only the outline where he once lay. The acidic soil had consumed him completely, nature's quiet final victory. The absence raised questions. Was he buried at all? Or was this some symbolic offering? A ship for a soul, not a body? No answer satisfied everyone. It still doesn't. The helmet, now iconic, was found in pieces, crushed by the weight of the earth. When reassembled, it looked like something from a fantasy novel, a face of metal and menace, with a grim fixed stare and a mustache etched in fierce curves. But it wasn't fantasy. It was real. Hand-forged by a craftsman whose name will never be known, meant to rest forever on the brow of a man who may have been called Redwald, or may not. The helmet alone changed what people thought they knew about the Saxons. This wasn't a culture of muddy huts and barbaric violence. This was art, ceremony, legacy. The discovery came just in time. Only weeks after the treasures were catalogued and packed away for safekeeping, the war began. German bombs began to fall across England. Many feared the artifacts might be destroyed before they could ever be displayed. They were hidden in the tunnels of the London Underground during the Blitz, kept away from fire and ruin. They slept again, just like the man they were buried with, only this time under stone instead of soil. It wasn't until years later that the public finally saw them. The gold, the garnets, the grim beauty of a world that once seemed so dim. Sutton Hoo reminded people that the past wasn't just a slow crawl of mud and misery. It had brilliance, complexity, emotion. It reminded scholars that even in the darkest ages, someone still cared about death enough to make it beautiful. Now, the mound has been carefully preserved, the site turned into a museum, and the treasures placed behind glass. Visitors come by the thousands to walk where Edith once stood and where Basil once dug, looking down into the shape of the ship, trying to imagine the moment before the soil returned. But the truth is, no display, no replica can capture what the earth held in silence for so long. Sutton Hoo is not just a burial. It is a conversation across time, a whisper from a people we thought we knew, telling us that they too believed in honor, in grief, and in the need to be remembered. And though the man is gone, the whisper remains. Chapter 3. Lost Runes in the Forge Ashes. The forge never went truly cold. Even on nights when no one worked the bellows and the embers dimmed to dull orange, a trace of warmth clung to the stones. In many Saxon villages, the forge was the one place that felt somehow alive. As if the fires remembered every blade ever shaped there, every tool hardened, every nail that sealed a coffin or a door. But there were whispers too soft, cautious ones shared only after a drink or two, that sometimes, if you sifted through the ash at dawn, you might find something strange. Not slag, not splinters of burned oak, but runes, marks scratched into bone or etched in soot onto the blackened floor, not by smiths, not by hands anyone remembered. These weren't the noble runes of kings or the carved poetry of bards. They were jagged, hurried, symbols shaped without elegance, scratched with fingers or blades, hidden under layers of cinders. Most were lost the moment the next fire was lit, burned away without a second thought. But every now and then, someone would spot one just before it vanished. And if you asked them what it meant, they'd only shake their head and say nothing good ever came from reading things that don't want to be found. Runes in the Saxon world were more than letters. They were forces, tools of magic, of oath-making and bone-breaking. Even those who could not read them feared them, because to carve a rune was to declare something permanent, and permanence in a world that was mostly mud was suspicious. Only gods carve things into stone. Humans were meant to be washed away. So when someone left a rune in a forge, a place of fire and change, it wasn't for art. It was for power, or revenge, or remembrance. One such story came from a village near the marshes, where the forge had stood for generations. The smith there was known not for his weapons, but for his refusal to make them. He made tools, hinges, nails, and occasionally cooking hooks. But when asked for a spearhead or a blade, he'd shake his head and mutter that his hands had done enough harm. He wasn't old, but he had the look of someone who had already lived too long. His right hand trembled slightly, not from weakness, but from something deeper. Some mornings he'd walk past the forge and keep walking, as if afraid to go inside. One night, when the village was still and the wind carried the stink of wet reeds, a child crept into the forge. He wanted to see the tools, maybe take a nail or two to trade with his friends. But what he found instead was a piece of bone half buried in the ash, with lines scratched into its surface. Not letters, not a name, just the spiral of lines that curved inward, tight and anxious. He ran out, bone in hand, and showed it to his father. The man stared at it, went pale, then threw it into the river without a word. He forbade the boy from ever entering the forge again. Days later, the smith vanished. No note, no footprints. Just his tools lined up with eerie care, as if he'd paused mid-task, then decided to disappear. The forge was left empty for years. No one wanted to touch it. When someone finally did, years later, they cleared the ash and found another bone beneath the hearthstone. This one marked with a different rune one that scholars would later identify as a warding mark, meant to hold something in, or keep something out. Of course, many dismiss such tales, say they're nothing but stories built on superstition, on the human tendency to see patterns in soot and paranoia and shadows. But runes were real. And the forge, like the burial mound, was a place where the barrier between worlds grew thin. Fire had a way of blurring edges, of turning the known into the unknowable. Melt iron, and it becomes something new. Burn a word into ash, and it might take on a life of its own. Some runes weren't hidden. In a few places, archaeologists have uncovered forged stones etched with protection symbols, small crosses or sun wheels intended to ward off ill luck. These weren't religious as much as they were practical, like carrying a charm or knocking on wood, but others went deeper. One stone, unearthed from a crumbled forge in Northumbria, bore an entire phrase in Old Saxon. Translated roughly, it read, "Do not forget the eye in the flame." Scholars debated its meaning. Some said it was poetic. Others said it was a warning. The smiths themselves were rarely literate, but they knew how to remember. Oral knowledge passed from master to apprentice, from father to son, from burned hand to burned hand. 1,000 tricks, none written down. But sometimes, perhaps when no one was watching, one of them picked up a shard of metal and scratched something into the wall, not for others to read. Just to mark a moment, a grief, a promise, or maybe a confession. When you stand in a Saxon forge now, what remains of one? Anyway, it's mostly rubble. Stones blackened with age, beams half swallowed by moss, but the feeling is still there. The silence feels thick, like something waiting to speak. If you dig gently through the ash, you might find a fleck of metal or a curve of bone. You won't know what it means. That's the point. Some messages were never meant to be understood, only witnessed. A glimpse. A whisper in the soot. In the modern museums that house Saxon artifacts, some of these odd items sit behind glass, labeled as ritual object, unidentified bone tool, or simply miscellaneous, but they aren't miscellaneous. Not really. They're fragments of meaning misplaced by time. The runes and the ashes were never meant to last. But they did, just long enough to remind us that even in fire, something might endure. They say the forge hears everything. The curses muttered under breath, the oaths sworn in anger, the apologies whispered when no one else is listening. It remembers. Not in the way a man remembers, with stories and timelines and logic, but in layers. Each one laid down like sediment. Ash, soot, sparks, sweat. And within those layers, perhaps, lie the runes left behind, not just scratched into tools or bone, but burned into the very idea of the place. There is one recorded tale found in 9th century sermon by a monk attempting to stamp out what he called the forge superstitions, watching a solid piece of iron glow and melt and turn to liquid. It must have felt like magic the first time, every time. It changed the man's relationship with the world. Trees burned. Rocks shattered. But sometimes the most unsettling things are the ones we almost understand. It's instinct more than inheritance. A way of saying, I was here. I touched this. This thing carries part of me. Maybe that's all the runes were in the end. Not magic, not prophecy. Just an act of defiance. A way to keep from disappearing completely. In a world where death came quickly and memory faded faster, every mark mattered. The feeling of meaning just out of reach. A name you half remember. A tune that tugs at your memory, but you don't know why. That's what the forge runes are. Clues to a story that was never written down. Because writing in the Saxon world was for monks and lords. The rest had to carve their truths wherever they could. Into wood, into stone, into the flicker of a flame. But metal that obeyed. Eventually, it resisted, but it yielded. And that resistance created reverence. Some believed the forge was a gate to something deeper. Not hell, necessarily, but a realm of transformation. And if you left a message there, a rune in the soot, it might reach beyond what the tongue could speak. Where he described visiting a settlement where every smith had marked his tools with what looked like letters, though they didn't form words. Among the usual tools and debris, they found a flat iron disc, roughly the size of a palm, etched with a spiral of characters that didn't match any known runic alphabet. The characters were orderly, methodical, carved with care and deep precision. Theories swirled. Early cipher, lost dialect, foreign influence. But the most compelling aspect wasn't the markings themselves. It was where they found a disc wedged between two stones that had clearly been mortared around it. As if someone wanted it hidden, but not discarded, a buried message. Perhaps even a warning? He accused them of invoking spirits, saying their work was guided not by saints, but by smoke. The monk's anger, while overwrought, reveals that even by then, the reputation of the smith as someone who straddled the line between craftsman and conjurer was firmly established. These marks, whether real or imagined, were born not out of ritual so much as desperation. The metalworker's life was too grim, too consumed by practical survival, to leave much room for mysticism. But in the quiet moments between strikes of the hammer, in the spaces when the iron cooled and the fire rested, there was always room for a little fear. Fear of what they couldn't see. Fear of what they couldn't fix with a tool or bend with heat. In one village on the edge of the Wessex forests, a forge was abandoned for over a decade after the blacksmith's death. Not because he had died poorly or because the tools were missing, but because someone found a slab of slate beneath the anvil, shards of crucibles arranged in circles, burned animal bones stacked beside melted coins. At first, archaeologists chalked it up to careless waste disposal or chance. But As more forges were mapped, it became harder to dismiss. Certain items always reappeared: charred finger bones, twisted lengths of wire, knife points driven deep into wood with no purpose. In modern terms, these look like symbols. Like someone was trying to send their message not just across space, but across time, not to us, but maybe to something watching them. The Saxons did not separate the spiritual from the practical. For them, forging wasn't just a trade. It was a kind of power, dangerous, transformative, and always on the edge of chaos. On it, drawn in wax that had hardened into a permanent crust, was a ring of runes arranged in a shape no one could quite agree on. Some said it was a trap, others a map. Still others refused to even look at it. When they finally covered the forge again, they didn't bury it out of respect. They sealed it like a wound. Piled stones and dirt over the hearth and let the weeds take over. That mound is still there, slumped and mossy. The children throw rocks at it sometimes. No one goes near it after dusk. Some of the unearthed forge sites reveal intentional patterns in where objects were discarded. Runes then became tools not only for communication, but for control. This makes a certain kind of sense. Imagine shaping metal with nothing more than fire and muscle. One particularly strange discovery came from a collapsed forge on a cliff near the North Sea, where erosion exposed a buried workspace that had once been sealed in by rockfall. Modern eyes tend to strip mystery away. We crave explanations, chemical reactions, historical context, material analysis. Even now, a few blacksmiths carry on the tradition, marking their tools with initials, symbols, sometimes meaningless shapes that become signatures over time. And perhaps, when the last fire burned low and the forge was swept clean one final time, some of those runes stayed behind, stubborn and silent, waiting for anyone to look close enough, to kneel in the soot and wonder what it meant to leave behind something that couldn't be spoken. Chapter 4. Supper beside a chieftain's mead hall hearth. The mead hall glowed like a beacon in the dark, its heavy wooden frame outlined by torchlight, thick thatch steaming where snow had melted from the rising warmth inside. Even from a distance, you could hear the hum voices low and steady, the scrape of wooden bowls on benches, the occasional clink of iron against horn. It was not laughter exactly, but something close. A loosened sort of tension, the kind that settles in once the weapons are racked, the doors are barred, and the wind is howling at the walls instead of through them. The chieftain sat near the hearth, legs wide, cloak heavy on his shoulders, a bronze ring glinting at his finger like a captured sun. This was his domain, and every spoon lifted, every song sung, happened beneath his gaze. The fire cracked loud and slow, sending shadows leaping across the carved beams overhead. Figures of wolves and serpents twisted together in worn outlines, their stories long forgotten by most who sat below. Smoke rose steadily toward the blackened rafters, curling around herbs hung to dry and the occasional chunk of salted meat suspended on a cord. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke, sweat, and stewed root vegetables. Your eyes watered just standing there, but no one complained. It was the smell of safety, of not freezing to death in the forest. The warmth soaked into your skin like oil into leather. You sat low on the bench, 2 spots down from the chieftain's favored fighter, who was currently gnawing on a bone with more enthusiasm than technique. Beside you, a weaver's apprentice picked at a slice of dark bread, her fingers ink-stained from counting threads. She didn't speak. Few did, at least not yet. Early in the meal, words were sparse. Food came first, then drink, then story. And only then, if the fire stayed high enough, came the songs. The ones with verses so old no one knew who wrote them, only how they ended. Across the hall, children chased each other beneath the benches until a shout from an elder sent them scurrying like mice. Dogs lay near the walls, ears twitching, occasionally rising to snap up a fallen scrap. The chieftain watched it all with a slow, practiced blink. He didn't smile. He rarely did. But every now and then he would grunt or shift slightly, and that was enough to let you know that, for tonight order held. Outside, the snow kept falling. Inside, the rules were simple. Speak when spoken to, drink when offered, and never, under any circumstance, insult the food. The stew that night was thick and dark, filled with barley, bits of dried mushroom, and small chunks of salted pork that had been hanging since autumn. It wasn't elegant, but it was hot, and it filled your belly in a way that bread never could. You tore pieces from a shared loaf, dipped them in the bowl, and chewed in rhythm with the sound of crackling fire. Every so often, a cup of mead made its way down the line, passed hand to hand with casual reverence. The mead was warm and spiced, sharp enough to catch in your throat, sweet enough to make you forget the bite. The chieftain's hall wasn't built for luxury. There were no cushions, no fine carvings, no imported goblets, but everything inside had been chosen with care. The benches were smooth from use. The bowls were mismatched, but none cracked. The hearthstone was polished from generations of fires, its surface marked with the faint lines of something, runes maybe, or just the grooves of countless embers. It was a place built for function, but filled with meaning. A hall was more than a building. It was memory with a roof. Somewhere near the fire, an old man leaned on his walking stick and began to murmur a tale. Not loud enough to silence the hall, but loud enough to catch a few ears. It was about a fox, or maybe a man who turned into one. The details shifted with each telling. You only caught pieces, something about a hunt, a lost ring, a bitter winter, but it didn't matter. The sound of his voice was enough. It carried the weight of evenings like this one, of cold dodged by firelight, of strangers turned to kin for one night by the shared act of staying alive. You felt the mead take hold slowly, a warmth rising from your chest into your cheeks, loosening the knots in your spine. The woman beside you leaned in slightly, not to speak, just to share your warmth. Her hand rested on the bench between you, her fingers twitching in time with the drum beat someone had started at the far end of the room. Not a drum in the modern sense, just a stretched hide tapped with fingers. But the rhythm did its work. Heads began to nod. Feet tapped. Even the dogs perked up. And then, as if summoned, a voice rose above the rest. Low, ragged, but strong. A song. The verses tumbled out, one after the other, half-chanted, half-sung, about a man who tried to steal from the gods and ended up trapped in a cave for 100 years. You didn't recognize all the words, but the ones you did chilled you. They spoke of darkness, of hunger, of a fire that wouldn't die. The chieftain listened with one eye half-lidded, his fingers toying with the ring on his hand. When the final verse came, there was silence, and then a single nod. No applause. Just the recognition. It was enough. Later, as the hall dimmed and the torches guttered low, people leaned in closer, sharing breath and space. Stories gave way to quiet. Heads bowed. Hands rested. Someone passed you a final cup. It was colder than the last, but you drank it anyway. You'd earned it, everyone had. The hearth was still glowing, the ashes pulsing with soft red light. The night outside stretched dark and wide. But here, inside, the world was small, manageable, almost gentle. And in that moment, as the chieftain shifted in his seat and the dogs curled tighter into themselves, you realized the mead hall wasn't just a place to eat or warm your hands. It was a shield. Not made of wood or iron, but of bodies, voices, shared warmth. And while the fire burned, the cold world outside had to wait. As the fire settled into a steady glow and the torches burned lower, the mead hall transformed. It didn't grow quieter exactly, but the noise changed shape. The clatter of bowls faded, replaced by the softer tones of murmured conversations and the occasional breath of a wind sneaking through the roof beams. No one seemed in a hurry to leave. That was part of the mead hall's unspoken promise. Once inside, once fed and warmed, you stayed until the night itself was too tired to go on. There were no clocks to chase, no appointments to keep. Only the slow winding down of the body and the steady crackle of the hearth to mark the passage of time. The chieftain hadn't moved much. He rarely did during these evenings. His role wasn't to entertain, but to anchor. His presence was reassurance that the hall would remain standing, that no one would be turned out into the cold, that no wild threats or ancient debts would erupt into violence, at least not tonight. He held his cup loosely in one hand, the other resting on his thigh, fingers twitching now and then as if tracing the outline of old battles. The rings on his hands weren't just for show. They were tokens of loyalty given and received, proof that others had trusted him with land, blood, and oaths. In a world without writing, a ring held the weight of a contract. Around him, the inner circle of favored warriors and household retainers relaxed into half reclines. Some leaned against the thick posts of the hall, their legs stretched out before them, boots steaming slightly from melted snow. A few had loosened their belts, revealing padded tunics underneath chainmail. There was a strange intimacy in the act, a reminder that under all the steel and swagger, they were men with sore backs and calloused feet. The chieftain allowed it. These moments were rare, and he knew better than to ruin them with formalities. Not all inside the hall belonged to the inner circle. Toward the edges, near the walls and low windows, sat others. Farmers who'd come to bring tribute. Traders passing through with sacks of amber or jars of honey. An old woman with wispy hair and a look of permanent irritation, likely a healer or wise woman of some kind. She sipped her mead slowly, occasionally muttering at the fire as though testing it for signs. No one disturbed her. These fringe dwellers were part of the ecosystem, tolerated and occasionally listened to when the mood allowed. Even in the center of power, the outliers had their place. The fire snapped suddenly, sending a spray of sparks into the air. A few people flinched, then chuckled. One of the hounds barked once and settled back down, tail thumping twice before stilling. A boy near the edge of the crowd, maybe 10 winters old, took the moment to rise and walk toward the hearth. He held a small wooden carving in his hands, something crude and newly made, perhaps a fish or bird, and held it out to the chieftain with both hands. For a breathless second, the hall hushed. The boy didn't speak. He just waited, eyes wide. The chieftain looked at the figure, then at the boy, then back at the figure. He took it gently, turning it over once in his palm, then gave a small nod. That was all. The boy beamed and returned to his place. No one applauded, but several adults exchanged nods. It was a small moment, but it carried weight. The boy had offered a gift. The chieftain had accepted. The hall had seen it. In a world where written records were rare, witnessed moments like that were everything. Later, when the hall had grown even warmer, and the haze of drink had softened the edges of thought, someone brought out a lyre. Not a grand instrument, just a small worn frame of wood and gut string, but the sound was clear. Soft plucking filled the space like light through smoke. The player didn't sing at first. He let the music carry its own message, one of quiet yearning, of longing without language. Eventually, he began to hum, and then, when the notes had grown familiar, he added words. The song told of a woman who waited for her husband at the edge of the forest, who watched the path each night until her hair turned white, and the trees forgot her name. No one interrupted. Everyone listened. Because in that moment, even the warriors who had slain and the weavers who had spun understood something about waiting, about love lost to the silence of trees. You watched the chieftain during the song. He didn't react much, but near the end, he touched the edge of his cup to his lips without drinking, a gesture of acknowledgement. Perhaps he knew someone like the woman in the song. Perhaps he had left someone waiting too long, long ago. Or maybe he simply liked the sound of it. Either way, he let the song end in peace, and the hall breathed again. As the night drew on, bodies began to lean heavier into one another. A few had already slipped sideways, dozing with their backs against pillars or friends. Blankets appeared, pulled from under benches or offered by kind hands. No one was turned away. If you slept in the hall, you were part of it for the night. Your name would be remembered in the morning, and a crust of bread offered without question. That, too, was the magic of the mead hall, not enchantment with spells, but safety built from tradition and shared exhaustion. When you finally laid down, your head near the feet of someone you barely knew, the smell of the hearth still in your hair, you stared at the underside of the rafters and watched the shadows dance. They moved like old memories. Not clear, not distinct, but real in their own way. You thought of the food, the songs, the fire, and the silence between stories. You thought of the chieftain's face, not stern exactly, but carved by time and duty. And you thought, as your eyelids sank and the warmth pulled you down, that for one night you had belonged somewhere. Not as a warrior, not as a hero, just as a person, fed, warm, safe. Outside, the wind howled over the moor, but inside the fire never died. Chapter 5. Waking to Soot and Frozen Tools. The sun did not rise quickly in the Saxon winter. It crept in, pale and reluctant, smudging the edge of the sky with a light that looked more like smoke than daybreak. When you woke, there was no warm glow through the window, no bird song, no soft beckoning into wakefulness. Just the slow awareness that your body was cold, the blanket stiff with frost along the edges where your breath had settled and frozen in the night. Your fingers curled into themselves for warmth, your toes numb, your breath tight in your chest, like the morning air had thickened while you slept. This was not a morning that welcomed you. It was a morning you had to take by force. The forge had not been lit since the previous evening, and it showed. The coals were dead, scattered in a dry gray crust across the hearth, like the last remains of a feast. The tools you'd left hanging from the beams had grown cold enough to sting if you touched them barehanded. Your anvil, the centerpiece of your world, looked like a chunk of ice carved from a cave, each edge glittering faintly with frost. You stared at it for a while, as if it might warm itself, as if it might decide to soften toward you. It didn't. You would have to bring it back to life. There was no breakfast waiting, just a hunk of yesterday's bread, hard as the stones that lined the hearth, and a skin of ale with a bite that hadn't mellowed overnight. You chewed slowly, forcing your jaw to move, each bite echoing in your skull like a distant drum. Hunger didn't scream here. It simply lived in your bones, a permanent ache, dull and deep. The cold did the same. It wasn't sharp, not anymore. It was a weight, something that sat on your shoulders and made every task slower, every breath an effort. You pulled on your tunic, stiff with soot and sweat from the week before, and wrapped your arms in lengths of wool that had once been sleeves but were now little more than fraying tubes. No gloves. Your fingers needed to feel the tools, even if they paid for it in cracked skin and blood under the nails. You stepped outside, the frost crunching beneath your feet like crushed glass. The sky overhead was the color of iron, flat and unyielding, and the trees nearby stood silent and white, their branches coated in rime like ancient bones. There was no one else awake. The village slept late in winter, but you didn't have that luxury. The forge wouldn't light itself. The orders from yesterday wouldn't make themselves. There were tools to be mended, and someone's cartwheel had cracked on the road to the marsh. They wanted it by noon. As if the fire cared what time it was. You gathered kindling, wood so dry it cracked in your hands. The first few attempts at lighting the hearth failed. The flint sparked, the twigs hissed, but the flame died before it caught. Your hands shook not from fear or fatigue, but from sheer cold and the effort of staying still long enough to coax fire into being felt like a battle. When the flame finally took, small and pale, you newly laughed, not joy, just relief. The kind that comes from knowing you won't freeze to death today. Probably. You pumped the bellows, slowly at first, then harder as the flame grew. The forge began to glow, not red yet, just orange around the edges, like a wound warming from within. You placed the first piece of iron into the coals, a shard from a broken blade that someone hoped to turn into a kitchen hook. Nothing glorious. Nothing worth remembering. But it was metal, and it was work, and that meant it mattered. The frost on your sleeves began to melt, soaking into the fabric, chilling you all over again. The tools warmed unevenly. The hammer felt like a stone, but the tongs grew hot too fast. You dropped them once, cursing aloud, the sound of your voice strange in the stillness. No one heard, or if they did, they didn't care. You worked with your back to the village, the forge casting long shadows across the dirt, your breath rising in steady clouds. By the time the iron was soft enough to shape, your muscles had begun to remember their roles. You fell into rhythm, not smooth, not elegant, but functional. You hammered without thinking, each strike deliberate, each movement shaped by necessity. There was no time for artistry, no place for perfection, only the task. Shape the metal, cool it, quench it, sharpen the edge, wrap the handle, Check for cracks. Start again. The day slipped by in fragments, bright sparks, dark iron, the hiss of water, the sting of smoke. You didn't stop for lunch, just chewed on dried meat while the next piece heated. The only time you paused was to wrap a rag around your thumb, burned from a moment's lapse in focus. The worst part wasn't the work. It was knowing that tomorrow, and the day after that would be the same. Wake up cold, light the fire, swing the hammer, bleed a little. Sleep again. No songs would be sung about your tools. No one would carve your name into stone. The best you could hope for was that your hinges didn't break, your nails didn't bend, and your blade stayed sharp long enough for someone to notice. And yet, in the quiet moments between tasks, when the fire crackled and the cold faded just enough for your hands to stop shaking, you felt something else. Not pride exactly, but presence. You existed. You made something from nothing. You held chaos at bay with your bare hands. And even if no one thanked you, even if they never knew your name, you knew. That was enough to strike the next blow. As the morning stretched into midday, the cold never truly left. It simply changed its shape. It no longer bit at your fingers like it did when you first rose from the straw, but sank into your spine like a second skeleton. Something stiff and unwelcome inside your frame. You moved anyway. The body learns how to work even when it hurts. It learns because it must. The forge doesn't wait for warm weather, and the orders don't disappear just because your hands have stopped listening to you. You wiped your brow with the back of your wrist, smearing soot across your forehead without noticing. The piece of iron you'd been hammering finally gave in, not out of kindness, but out of exhaustion. Like most things in your life, you placed it on the shelf with the others, unfinished, but passable, and stretched your arms, feeling the tug of muscle and the sharp jolt of a joint that had twisted years ago and never quite set right. The ache was familiar, predictable. In its own way, it was comforting. At least it reminded you that you were still here, still standing. You didn't think of yourself as a blacksmith. You weren't paid enough for that word. You were just a man with a hammer and enough stubbornness to keep lifting it. Occasionally, a visitor would come by. Sometimes it was a village woman needing a cooking hook or a cracked cauldron mended. Other times, it was one of the younger lads with a half-finished spear or the broken blade of a scramasax he dropped trying to show off. Today it was a trader, short, with a belly like a full wineskin and a nose red from drink or cold or both. He handed you a rusted horseshoe and a coin worn smooth on one side. No explanation, just a grunt and a nod toward the fire. You took it without speaking. There was no need. The work explained itself. You turned the horseshoe in your hands, examining the wear, noting where it cracked along the curve. You recognized the kind of damage immediately. The kind that came from lazy walking, probably a tired horse carrying too much weight over frozen roads. You placed it beside the hearth to warm and leaned over to check the fire. The coals needed turning. You grabbed the poker and stirred, releasing a gust of sparks that flew upward, dancing for a brief second before dying in the draft. One landed on your sleeve and sizzled. You didn't flinch. Outside, the wind had picked up. It rattled the shutters and hissed between the planks of the walls. You glanced out and saw the gray sky thickening, a promise of snow coming too soon. You'd need to finish early today, before the drifts made the road too deep to walk. Not for your own sake, but for the apprentice boy who'd be along at dusk to help haul the tools inside. He was small and stubborn and never wore proper shoes. You told him to, of course. He nodded each time and came back the next day with rags wrapped around his feet. You stopped asking. You pulled the horseshoe from the edge of the hearth with your tongs and laid it on the anvil. The sound of metal on metal was dull at first, not the sharp ring you like to hear, but you worked it anyway. You tapped along the bend, reshaped the edge, reheated it, and quenched it fast, watching the steam rise in a hiss that felt louder than it was. It was a good repair. You handed it back to the trader with an open palm. He looked at it, nodded, and dropped the coin in your hand. He said nothing, but his silence meant it would do. He left without another word, the door thudding shut behind him. You looked down at the coin. It was stamped with a face you didn't recognize. Not one of your kings. Maybe Frankish, maybe older. You tucked it away. The value didn't matter. Coins were just weight in your hand, unless someone else believed they were worth something. You trade it later for meat or salt. You rarely held on to things. There wasn't space for sentiment in a life this cramped. Only tools stayed with you. And pain, those didn't trade well. The light in the forge shifted as the sun dipped lower, casting everything in a colder shade of gold. You watched the shadows stretch across the floor, reaching toward the far wall where you'd marked your progress in scratches. Each line was a finished order. You stopped marking years ago. There was no point. The work never ended. The scratches told no story. Only time passed. Some men counted years by harvests. You counted by burns? When the boy finally arrived, his cheeks were flushed and his hair full of snowflakes. He stomped inside without knocking and began stacking the tongs into their box. You nodded at him. He didn't speak. That was fine. He'd learned more from silence than anything you could say. You watched him work, correcting him only once when he placed a rasp too close to the edge of the shelf. He blinked, moved it, and kept going. That was how you'd been taught, too. Pain and repetition. There had never been another way. You poured water over the hearthstones to kill the flames. The hiss echoed in the small space like a serpent retreating. The smoke thinned slowly, rising toward the ceiling in one last curl. You wiped your hands on your apron and stepped outside. The air hit you like a wall. You shivered, teeth clenched, breath turning white again. Snow was beginning to fall in earnest, flakes fat and slow, swirling around like they had nowhere else to be. You stood in it for a moment, watching the rooftops vanish under white. The boy tugged at your sleeve and pointed at the coals you'd set aside for tomorrow. You nodded. He knew the routine. If you didn't prep them now, you'd spend half the morning trying to coax warmth from nothing. You both moved through the motions, gathering wood, setting tools inside, locking the box with the rusted clasp it had held since before you were born. When everything was in its place, you turned to go. As you walked back toward your hut, boots crunching in the snow, you felt the tiredness settle into you. Not the kind that Stig could fix. The kind that came from knowing that nothing you made would last forever. Tools broke, blades dulled, even iron bent in the end. But tomorrow you'd wake, light the fire again, and hammer until your arms begged you to stop. Because if you didn't, no one else would. That was the truth of it. In the Saxon world, comfort didn't come from ease. It came from the knowledge that you had endured. One more day. Chapter 6. The Mercian King Who Feared Iron. The king's hall stood at the edge of the river like it didn't belong. Not because of its grandeur, there was no gold shining from the beams, no carved stone or lofty arches, but because of how quiet it seemed, how heavy the air felt even before you stepped through the gate. It was the kind of place people entered slowly, heads low, with the same reverence they might show to a burial mound. You could feel the weight of the man inside it, even before you saw his face. He was the king of Mercia, a man whose name traveled farther than his feet ever did, and whose silence unnerved even his closest warriors. People feared him not because he barked orders or swung his sword, but because he didn't need to. They said he was once like any other warlord, quick to anger, fast with his blade, always the first to leap into battle. But something changed. No one knew when exactly. There were no records, just stories. Some said it happened after he slaughtered a rival chieftain in single combat, only to find the man's infant son crawling through the ash afterward, his tiny hand pressed against a burnt helmet. Others claimed he'd seen a vision while standing over the body of a raider, the blood still warm on his sword, when the sun flickered and his shadow disappeared for the span of 3 breaths. Whatever happened, the king came back from that battle changed. He ordered his blade buried, not lost, not discarded, buried, wrapped in cloth, sealed in oak, and buried beneath the floor of his own hall, where he could walk over it every day and remember. After that, he ruled differently. He didn't attend executions. He didn't join the hunts. And most oddly, he refused to touch iron. He would not eat with iron utensils, would not wear rings of forged metal. And when he needed to sign a treaty, he did it with a stylus carved from bone. At first, the nobles whispered. Then they followed. That's the thing about kings. When they act strange, you call it wisdom. When peasants do it, you call it madness. Smiths in Mercia learned quickly that if they wanted to keep the king's favor, they couldn't bring their wares too close. Iron tools had to be left at the edge of the hall and announced with care, like they might explode if mishandled. When the hearth needed tending, it was done with wooden pokers. When nails were required for a new bench, they were driven in with antler hammers. It was inconvenient, but no one questioned it. Not after the first man who joked about the king's aversion to metal was found outside the hall with his teeth shattered, not knocked out, shattered, as if something had clamped his jaw shut and let it grind until it gave in. And yet, he was not unkind, not in the way warlords often are. He did not overtax his people. He did not send boys to die for his borders, unless he saw no other way. He walked among the villages sometimes, wrapped in plain cloth, watching the forges burn and the weavers work, asking quiet questions with eyes that didn't blink enough. When a child broke a leg falling into a ditch, he sent herbs and meat. When a widow lost her only cow, he sent grain, but always through messengers, always through others. He never gave anything with his own hands. Not since the change. Some believed he feared iron because of its power, that he had seen too much of what it could do, how it split skulls and tore through shields, how it made weak men bold and bold men dead. Others thought it wasn't fear at all, but reverence. That he treated iron like a sacred thing, something not meant for daily use, but for rites and warnings. A few said he had dreams, terrible ones, where the tools he'd once wielded returned to accuse him. That he would wake in a cold sweat, fingers twitching like they were still holding a hilt slick with blood. One story one that never made it into any written chronicle, but passed from servant to steward in low whispers, told of a night during a thunderstorm, when lightning struck the hall and split one of the roof beams. The king, woken by the crack, stood barefoot on the floor, eyes locked on the sky. When a guard approached, sword drawn, the king turned and ordered the blade dropped. When the guard hesitated, the king stepped forward, stared him down, and asked one question. Do you know what iron remembers? The guard, confused, said nothing. The king reached down, picked up a stone from the hearth, and said softly, It remembers its shape, even when melted, even when broken. It remembers. After that, the guard was sent to the borderlands. He never returned. Despite, or perhaps because of his behavior, the king kept peace in his territory longer than any ruler before him. The neighboring clans stopped testing Mercian boundaries. The coin stayed steady, trade increased, and the mead halls began to sing songs not of war, but of strange wisdom. Of a king who spoke little and feared his own sword. Of a hall where no metal rang, but the fire burned always. It's tempting to paint this king as eccentric, a relic of an age without reason. But the truth is, he understood something most people ignored. That iron isn't just material, it's history. Memory. Every tool, every blade, every nail driven into wood carries the story of its shaping. And if you believe even a little that stories can shape the world, then perhaps he was right to fear it, or to honor it, or both. The king's reluctance to touch iron grew stranger as the years went on. By his fourth winter in power, he no longer allowed even his guards to carry blades within the central hall. Spears were set outside under the awning, and daggers remained sheathed and tied shut with strips of linen, as if the act of drawing one inside the walls might crack the very beams of the roof. Those who visited him were often unsure what to make of this. Some took it as a sign of softness, a weakness disguised as ritual. Others, after spending an evening in his presence, came away feeling that perhaps he simply knew something they didn't. It wasn't the look in his eye that convinced them. It was the way silence moved around him like a second skin. You could stand 2 feet from the Mercian king and still feel as though he was watching you from across a battlefield. One of the king's longest-serving household men, a tall and nervous man named Cuthard, once said the worst part of his job was not the strange rules, but the quiet. It isn't that he doesn't speak, Cuthard told a passing monk one winter evening. It's that when he does, it's always something you can't forget. That same monk, Years later, would write of the king in a private letter never meant for public eyes. There are those who seek to conquer the world with sword and fire, and those who do it with silence, so dense it snuffs out the flame. The hall itself began to change under the king's rule. Where once there were racks for shields and weapons, there are now rows of carved wood panels, stories from merchant history etched in careful detail. Battles reduced to symbols, triumphs captured in the twist of an animal's neck or the swoop of a hawk overhead. It was said the king commissioned these not to honor war, but to remember its cost. When a guest asked him once why there were no depictions of victory, only loss and survival, he answered with a single phrase: "Victory is only death with different timing." In his 5th year, a noble from the east arrived with a gift, a longsword forged by his own smiths. Its hilt inlaid with garnets and amber, its blade so finely honed it could shave bark from an ash tree without nicking. He'd presented it to the king during the evening feast, laying it carefully across his palms. The hall quieted as everyone waited for the king's response. He did not move. He stared at the sword for a long time, long enough that people began to shift in their seats. Finally, he nodded at one of his stewards, who stepped forward, took the weapon, and placed it in a wooden chest lined with wool. The king then raised his cup, nodded once to the noble, and continued eating. No word of thanks, no gesture of admiration. The sword was never seen again. By the time his 6th winter arrived, the fear or reverence of iron had begun to seep into his laws. He ordered that weapons not be buried with the dead unless they were broken first, to release the binding, as the decree stated. Smiths were forbidden to forge blades during the dark moon unless given express permission by the hall. A child who had once found an iron dagger in the roots of a tree and brought it home was said to have gone mute within the month, though most said it was illness. Still, the story stuck. Despite the growing superstition around him, or maybe because of it, the king's rule remained solid. Raiders bypassed Mercian territory, choosing softer targets to the north and west. Diplomats who once laughed behind his back now spoke of him in careful tones. A bishop, sent to negotiate a trade route, returned with a pale face and a refusal to discuss what he'd seen. All he would say was that the king's hearth glowed brighter than any church lamp, and that there were things in the air there that did not belong in a men's hall. Still, the people respected him. They might not have understood him, but they feared him in a way that wasn't entirely unkind. He taxed fairly, saw disputes settled without bloodshed, and ensured that during each of Mercia's long winters, no village under his banner starved. He walked the land alone sometimes, carrying no weapon, accompanied only by a hound with a milky eye and a limp. Children would run after him, calling his name, only to fall silent when he turned. Not because he was cruel, just because there was something in his gaze that made you feel like he'd already seen you long before you were born. The closest thing to a rebellion came when a younger warlord from the borderlands tried to mock the king's rules by sending him a gift of a horseshoe twisted into a spiral and engraved with a jeering rune. It was delivered by a trembling courier who barely met the king's eye. The king took the gift, examined it quietly, then ordered it melted down and reforged into a plowshare. He sent it back with a single message: "Make something that feeds the living." The warlord never replied. Months later, his settlement was burned not by Mercian soldiers, but by an early thaw and a reckless spark. The irony was lost on no one. In the final years of his reign, the king spent more time alone. His hall grew quieter, his councils shorter. He spoke rarely, sometimes days apart. When he did, his words carried the weight of prophecy. He once said to a visiting noble, "Iron cuts not only the flesh, but the thread." The noble, confused, asked what thread. The king only smiled and gestured to the hearth, where the fire was dying, the last ember glowing like an eye half closed. Eventually, he stopped appearing in public. Meals were left at the door of his chamber. The hall was still maintained, fires still lit, laws still followed, but the man at the center of it all vanished from view. When he finally died, no one knew until the 3rd day, when a servant brought his breakfast and found the chamber cold and empty. There was no body, just his robe folded on the bed and his rings laid carefully beside the hearthstone. His burial was simple. No sword, no mound. Only a circle of stones laid in the center of the hall, beneath the beam where sunlight touched at dawn. Some say his soul slipped through the cracks in the world, into a place where iron never rusted and fire spoke in forgotten tongues. Others say he became part of the land itself, a king so strange and solemn that even death didn't know how to claim him. Chapter 7: Secrets of the Black Earth Pits. The pits looked like nothing at first. Just shallow dips in the landscape, dark patches of earth where the grass grew thinner, where the wind always seemed to blow a little colder, even on warm days. The farmers avoided them not out of superstition, they said, but because nothing ever grew there. Not oats, not barley, not even weeds. The soil was wrong somehow. Greasy, too soft in some places, too clouded in others. The old men called it black earth and left it at that. When archaeologists began digging centuries later, they called it something else entirely. They called it a mystery. The first proper excavation happened by accident. A collapsed hillside during a sheep drive revealed a pocket of dark soil, layered with ash, charcoal, and strange bits of slag that didn't match the surrounding geology. At first, they thought it was just an old forge, a temporary smelting site. But the deeper they dug, the stranger it became. Beneath the surface were concentric layers of burned debris wood, bone, iron scrap, and in the center of it all, fragments of human teeth. Not a full skeleton. Just teeth, scattered as if they'd been placed deliberately. Or left behind by something that didn't need the rest. As word spread, more pits were found across the region. All similar in size, about 6 to 10 feet across, rarely deeper than 5. Always filled with blackened earth and fragments of metal tool, nails bent into spirals, hooks twisted into symbols. Once even a key, its handle carved in the rough shape of a hand with 2 fingers missing. No 2 pits were identical, but all followed the same rhythm: burn, bury, abandon. They were never reused, no crops planted, no structures raised above them. Just silence. Scholars argued over their purpose. Some said they were sacrificial sites, places where offerings were burned to appease forgotten gods. Others claimed they were waste pits, the result of collapsed forges where refuse was dumped and slowly compacted by time. A few speculated that they were burial grounds for those not fit to be buried elsewhere, smiths who had broken laws, or whose creations had caused too much death to be forgiven, but none of the theories explained everything, especially not the teeth. One of the strangest pits, found near an old Mercian settlement, revealed a circular ring of stones around the rim, each etched with a different mark. Not runes, not letters, just simple shapes, crosses, spirals, triangles, lines. There were no tools in that pit, just bones, dozens of them. Bird bones mostly, but also a few from dogs and sheep. And in the very center, a single skull. Human, adult, gender unknown, no signs of violence. Just a deep crack along the crown that looked less like trauma and more like pressure, something heavy pressing down over years. The soil samples taken from the black earth showed unusually high concentrations of iron, even in pits where no tools were found. That puzzled the researchers. There was too much iron for it to come from rusted nails alone. Some began to wonder if something had been poured into the soil. A mixture, maybe. A concoction meant to seal the site, to keep whatever was buried there from getting out. The theories got wilder from there. Some insisted the pits were cursed, that ancient metals hold memories. That fire doesn't destroy everything. It preserves some things in ways we don't understand. Folklore supported the unease. Villagers who lived near the pits spoke of dreams, vivid ones, filled with heat. With the clang of invisible hammers, with voices speaking in tongues their waking minds couldn't recall. One man claimed he walked to the pit in his sleep and woke kneeling beside it, hands covered in ash, though there had been no fire for days. Another, a woman who'd grown up near the largest cluster of pits, said she could hear whispers when the wind blew across them. Not words, just intention. Something watching, listening. Despite the ominous signs, the black earth pits remained oddly consistent, always circular, always shallow. Never disturbed by roots or rain, They didn't spread, they didn't shift. They simply remained, waiting, when new homes were built nearby in more recent centuries. The builders took care to avoid them. Not because they feared ghosts, they said, but because the earth there felt wrong under the shovel. Whatever that meant, they didn't care to explain. A recent scan using ground-penetrating radar revealed something even more unnerving. Some of the pits, especially those clustered in older sites, formed patterns, not natural ones. Geometric ones, rings, lines, even a crude spiral stretching across half a hillside. The positioning didn't align with known roadways or settlement grids. One researcher proposed it might be some kind of forgotten calendar or ritual map. Another said it looked more like a lock, as if the land itself had been designed to keep something sealed. None of this is conclusive, of course. For every theory, there are a dozen holes. No texts mention the pits directly. No chronicles speak of them. And the Saxons, meticulous in their oral traditions, seem to have collectively chosen silence. That's perhaps the most curious part. They sang of wars and kings, of wolves and harvests, but never of the Black Earth. Maybe it's because the pits weren't part of life. Maybe they were where life ended. Or maybe, just maybe, they weren't meant to be remembered at all. The second major excavation of the Black Earth pits took place decades after the first, far from the original site in the quiet rise of a wooded valley where shepherds claimed to hear metals scraping in the wind. They thought it was nonsense. Of course, wind whistling through bramble, crows flapping their wings above, but the stories persisted. When the archaeologists arrived, led by a team from a small university with a grant too small for comfort, they expected another refuse site, perhaps a collapsed smelting trench or a midden with a few rusted tools. What they found was harder to explain. This pit, uncovered beneath a mound of moss and wildflowers, wasn't a single cavity, but a series of layered circles, each smaller than the last, like a series of bowls nested into one another, each filled with darker, richer soil. The first layer held broken nails and iron filings. The second, fragments of charcoal carved with lines so thin and jagged they looked like they'd been drawn by fingernails. The third, deeper still, yielded nothing but clumped earth. No bones, no tools, just black soil that clung to gloves like wet tar. The deepest layer, nearly 4 feet down, revealed something stranger still, a stone tablet, no larger than a hand, etched with a symbol that didn't match any known runic system. It was just a line broken at odd angles, a jagged pathway that twisted inward like a root curling into itself. No one could say what it meant. But every member of the team who touched it said it felt warm, though the soil around it was cold. They documented it, photographed it, and packed it away. But a week later, the lead researcher suffered a stroke. He was 43, fit, careful, no known medical conditions. Another team member left the dig, entirely after waking 3 nights in a row with what he called the sound of breathing under the floorboards. None of this was mentioned in the final excavation report. Universities tend not to fund the supernatural. More black earth pits surfaced over time, some near old Roman roads, others deep in the countryside, always in places no one remembered building anything. One site yielded what looked like a twisted harness, as if a plow or yoke had been heated, bent, and buried alongside crushed wheat husks. It raised the possibility that not just tools, but entire acts of agriculture, of survival, were being offered or perhaps abandoned. A rejection of the land, or a sacrifice to make it fertile again. One researcher proposed that the pits were not graves, but conversations started by people who had no way to answer the questions they faced. Famine, war, disease. What do you do when you can't fix the world? You bury a part of it and hope something changes. A few pits were discovered to contain nothing at all, just layers of blackened soil. No artifacts, no bones. These were perhaps the most unsettling, because even emptiness speaks. Even absence means something was taken. One particular pit, outside the village, long since vanished into fields, had been carefully ringed with animal bones, all cleaned and set like spokes in a wheel. At the center only ash, fine, white, and cold, as if the fire that had once burned there had done so for days, long enough to remove every trace of what it consumed. Modern chemical analysis revealed that the soil in and around the pits carried compounds not native to the region. Elements like phosphorus and manganese in concentrations that suggested extreme heat and an unusual mix of burned organic and inorganic material. In simpler terms, something was burned there that shouldn't have been, or at least not together. Bones, wood, iron, possibly even cloth. The result was a soil so nutrient dead that even after centuries, grass struggled to grow. Some theorized these were punishment pits, where tools or people were disposed of for breaking taboos. Others leaned toward ritual cleansing, places where something profane was sealed beneath fire and soil to cleanse a space. A few, the more imaginative ones, suggested that the pits were protective, intended not to trap, but to warn, not graves, but signposts. Places marked not with stones or runes, but with the lingering discomfort of bad ground and reluctant roots. One local farmer, whose land bordered a pit discovered only after a heavy rain unearthed its edge, said he remembered his grandmother telling him never to plant near the slope. "It don't like to be disturbed," she used to say. He'd laughed at her once for saying it. Then he tried plowing there. The blade caught on something he couldn't dig out, broke the iron teeth. When he went back the next day with help, there was nothing there. Just smooth soil. He never tried again. The strangest account came not from a dig, but from a child. A girl, age 12, whose family had lived near the woods for generations. She told her mother one night at supper that she'd seen someone standing in the black patch by the edge of the trees. Not a man, not a woman, just a figure, tall and still, wrapped in smoke. Her mother scolded her for lying. But later that evening, the girl pointed out the window and said, "He's waiting again. Their parents found nothing." But the next day, the pit was warm to the touch, though the frost had not melted anywhere else for miles. What remains most unsettling about the black earth pits is not their content, but their silence. No records mention them. No stories explain them. No lineage claims them. They exist without context, without song, without prayer. In a culture that sang of everything, birth, harvest, war, death, this absence feels louder than any drum. It suggests that some things were not meant to be remembered, that some knowledge was buried with intent, not out of ignorance, but out of mercy. Maybe they were trying to forget, or to spare us the remembering. Chapter 8. Gold Rings and Gilded Lies and the Warlord's Tent. The warlord's tent looked more like a prize taken from a distant land than something made in the mud and fog of the Saxon world. It was high and round, the canvas dyed with crushed berries and stitched with red thread that had faded into a rusted pink, yet still suggested power. Tall wooden poles held the frame upright, driven deep into the ground like stakes in a battlefield, and the edges were weighted with stones wrapped in waxed leather to keep them from flapping in the coastal wind. From the outside, it looked like a throne disguised as a traveler's shelter. From the inside, it looked like a trap lined in silk. The tent moved with the wind. It creaked and sighed like it remembered too much. Beneath its canopy, the warlord sat on a raised stool covered in the fur of an animal that no longer existed anywhere near the marshes. His hair was braided with tiny bones, bird, rabbit, maybe even fox, and his beard had grown down over a chain that looped through one ear and hung like a necklace no one dared touch. His fingers were wrapped in rings. Gold mostly, but also bronze, silver, and something that looked like polished jet. Each ring was different. One bore the face of a wolf. Another, a serpent coiled around itself. One was shaped like a knot, so tightly woven that your eyes hurt trying to trace it. They weren't just jewelry. They were trophies, contracts, lies. The rings were how he ruled. Not with swords, not with armies, but with promises made and sealed in metal. When he gave you a ring, it meant you belonged to something. A blood oath, a deal struck, a silence bought. You wore it, or you paid for it. Some men received rings after battle, slipped onto their fingers while they bled on the field. Others were handed them in private, behind the tent, with only a nod to mark the agreement. And some took their rings off after dark and never woke up. He called himself Bjornhelm, though no one knew if that was his true name. Some said he'd been born the bastard of a king's scribe and a foreign woman from across the sea. Others whispered that he was the child of a raider and a nun, raised on salt and scripture, taught both how to kill and how to pray, and rarely did either. What was clear was that he understood the power of appearance. His tent was always just a little too fine, his boots too clean, his blade never shown but always mentioned. He made sure people knew just enough about him to be afraid of the rest. The inside of the tent smelled of damp wool, boiled meat, and smoke. Not unpleasant, but heavy. The air clung to your skin. Maps hung from the sides, scraps of leather daubed with chalk and oil. Not to scale, but marked with rivers, hills, and tiny runes that only Bjornhelm understood. One of his favorite tricks was to draw a circle on a map and stare at it until someone asked what it meant. He would never answer, not directly. Just smile and say, "That's where the story changes." His council was made of 5 men and 2 women, all chosen for their ability to keep secrets and hold their tongues. They sat around him in a half moon, watching, waiting. None of them ever touched their rings while in his presence. That was another rule. Don't fiddle, don't show doubt. The rings weren't jewelry anymore. They were chains that looked like gifts. And the warlord kept count of them. Every ring, every name, every oath. He remembered who owed what, and who had forgotten. One story told of a merchant who tried to sell him stolen goods, a goblet that had once belonged to a Northumbrian thane. The merchant presented it boldly, claiming it had come from a battlefield long forgotten. Bjornhelm accepted it with a smile, turning it over in his hand. Then he reached into his cloak and pulled out a ring. The same ring the thane had worn, one that matched the engraving on the goblet's stem. He didn't speak. He just placed the ring inside the cup and handed it back. The merchant left the tent pale, and no one saw him again. That was how it worked. No shouting, no spectacle. Just gestures, symbols, meanings buried beneath layers of silence. Bjornhelm didn't need to raise his voice. The rings did it for him. Each one was a weight carried by the man or woman who wore it, a debt that pressed into the flesh over time, making the hand ache without reason. There were rumors, of course, whispers that some of the rings weren't made by smiths at all, but pulled from ancient graves, cleaned and reforged in a fire that burned blue. That Bjornhelm wore a ring on his left thumb that couldn't be removed without drawing blood. A ring that pulsed when he slept. That he spoke to it sometimes. That when the wind blew from the east, it answered. Whether any of that was true didn't matter. It was the image that mattered. The story. He ruled through narrative as much as power. Each lie gilded just enough to shine. Each truth wrapped in just enough shadow to be doubted. He kept his people guessing. Loyal, but wary. Obedient, but never comfortable. And through it all, the rings remained, growing in number. Worn not just by warriors, but by midwives, messengers, and even a boy who'd once saved his life during a storm crossing a frozen river. That boy, now grown, still bore the ring. He kept it on a cord around his neck and never spoke of it. When asked, he only said it fits better in silence. The most curious thing about Bjornhelm's rule wasn't the number of wars he won, but how few he needed to fight. It was as if his enemies believed he knew something they didn't, as if they feared the terms of defeat more than the sting of battle itself. His tent, always pitched at the edge of conflict and never deep in it, became known as the place where outcomes changed without a single sword drawn. Not because he was soft, but because he made sure that violence always came second to the suggestion of it. He believed in symbols more than steel. And the rings he handed out, always from the same leather pouch, always one at a time, were never just gifts. They were seeds planted in the minds of men. A reminder that loyalty didn't have to be bought with blood, only tied to a finger and worn long enough to feel like part of the hand. But the deeper truth about Bjornhelm's rings was known only to a few. Not the ones he gave in public, not the fat bands given during feasts or ceremonies, but the thin ones, the plain ones. The rings, given in silence, often at night, slipped into a palm or left at the edge of a bedroll. These rings bore no crest, no knotwork. They looked like nothing, cheap and light. But every one of them marked the bearer as bound to a task not yet spoken. These were not favors. They were the instructions waiting to be delivered. One such ring turned up years later in the pouch of a dying messenger. He'd collapsed on the road between settlements, ribs broken, his horse long gone. The ring was wrapped in cloth with a single phrase scratched onto a strip of bark. Wait until the fires blew. No one ever figured out what it meant. But weeks later, a granary 2 towns overburned in the middle of a snowstorm. The flame said to glow unnaturally in the night. The ring had vanished by then, taken by one of the healers, or maybe buried with the man. Either way, Bjornhelm never acknowledged it. He didn't have to. His camp functioned less like a kingdom and more like a loom, with the warlord as the weaver pulling threads no one else could see. If he noticed a blacksmith growing too popular, he'd send him away with a new contract, a new village, a ring and a warning not to forget where his furnace had first been lit. If a warrior grew restless, he might be sent on an errand that kept him walking for months, escorting a caravan, protecting a relic, delivering a letter to a man who didn't exist. The goal wasn't punishment, it was balance. Bjornhelm didn't believe in killing problems when you could simply stretch them thin. He rarely raised his voice. When he did, it carried like stones skipping over still water, slow, deliberate, and far-reaching. It said that the only time he shouted was when someone tried to give him a ring in return. A chieftain from the west, eager to forge an alliance, offered him a heavy gold band inlaid with jet and emerald, carved with the image of twin serpents. Bjornhelm looked at it for a moment, then turned over his table, scattering ink, meat, and scrolls across the floor. I do not wear what I did not forge, he said, his voice low but furious. The chieftain left without his ring. Days later, his lands were divided between 2 lesser lords who had never met each other until that very week. Both wore simple bronze rings when they arrived to swear loyalty. Not all of Bjornhelm's rings were for others. He wore 3 at all times. One on his right thumb, thick and dark as iron but warm to the touch. One on his left index finger, so smooth it reflected no light. And one hidden and worn around his neck on a strip of linen stained with blood. No one knew where it had come from. No one asked. Once, a girl from a fishing village asked him about the hidden ring as he passed through during a spring festival. He looked at her for a long moment, then said, "It's the only one I didn't give." She laughed, thinking it a joke. He didn't laugh back. There were those who thought the rings gave him power. Not magic exactly, but influence twisted into metal, compressed and set around flesh like a binding spell. Every time someone accepted a ring, they became part of his reach. Every time they failed him, the ring would turn cold, or so the stories went. That was the difference between Bjornhelm and the kings who ruled with crowns. A crown rested on the head. His power clung to the body like guilt. Toward the end of his rule, the tent grew quieter. Fewer visitors, less music. The walls, once covered in trophies and war banners, were stripped bare. Some said he was preparing for death. Others said he had started to fear the rings. That he no longer gave them freely, but kept them in a chest at the foot of his cot, counting them at night like a miser with coins he could never spend. One man, a torchbearer who once served in his inner circle, claimed that the warlord had begun speaking to the rings, asking them questions no one else could hear. The final days were shrouded in rumor. Some said he was killed by a ring bearer who had turned against him, cutting the rings from his fingers and throwing them into the sea. Others insisted he walked into the forest alone, leaving only his tent behind. The rings piled on his stool like a crown no one dared wear. When the tent was found, it had collapsed in on itself. Inside was nothing but silence, and a single ring embedded into the dirt, half melted, as if it had been resting in fire for days. The rings are still out there, in private boxes, in forgotten drawers, in the soil beneath old stones. Some are worn without knowledge of their origin. Others are passed down as heirlooms, strange pieces with no story. Just wait. But those who know, those who remember Bjornhelm, never wear them. They bury them. Deep, without a word. Because some oaths don't end when the man who made them disappears. Some promises keep breathing, long after the hand that forged them has gone cold. Chapter 9. Bleeding Fingers at the Smelting Pit. The smelting pit was never meant to be beautiful. It was a hole in the ground ringed with stone, blackened by fire and sweat, and surrounded by the smell of burning charcoal, damp soil, and scorched wool. It sat just outside the village, far enough that the smoke wouldn't choke the elders, but close enough that the noise of iron being born into form could still be heard from the longhouse. The path to it was worn smooth by years of boots and bare feet, and the closer you came to the pit, the more the air changed, thicker, hotter, even when the fires weren't lit. It was the kind of place where the wind stopped blowing. The kind of place where the dirt felt greasy underfoot, and even birds seemed to avoid flying overhead. Smelting wasn't the kind of job a child dreamed of doing. No songs were sung about the men who stood over the pit all day with arms shaking and shirts soaked through with heat and grime. It wasn't noble. It wasn't glorious. It was slow, brutal, and full of small, invisible dangers. The dust could choke you. The fumes could leave you dizzy. The tools were heavy, the ore unpredictable, and the heat constant. You didn't work the smelting pit because you wanted to. You worked it because someone had to, and your name happened to be the one spoken when that job was handed down. The days began early. Before the sun had risen, the smelters were already moving. First, the charcoal had to be prepared. Not wood, not any more proper charcoal, burned slowly in sealed pits days in advance. It was lighter, hotter, and essential. The furnace wouldn't burn without it, not hot enough to coax iron from rock. You'd carry it in woven sacks, dust rising with each step, coating your face, your teeth, your thoughts. It got everywhere under your nails, in your food, in your breath. You learned to live with the taste of ash. Then came the ore, heavy sacks filled with chunks of stone, some glittering with promise, others dull and useless. The trick was knowing which was which. That knowledge wasn't taught, it was absorbed. You learned by watching the older men, by listening to their muttered curses when the wrong rock went in and ruined the whole batch. Once, an apprentice threw in a piece of wet ore, and the furnace cracked. The heat turned the water to steam in an instant, and the explosion sent stone flying like thrown blades. He lost 2 fingers that day. No one shouted. No one comforted him. They just wrapped the hand and kept the fire going. The process itself was strange, a kind of long ritual with no priest. You'd build up layers in the furnace charcoal, or more charcoal, and again, like stacking layers of breath and blood. Then you'd light it, slowly, carefully. The fire had to spread from the bottom up, and it had to stay hot. Not warm, not glowing, blistering. You'd watch the furnace with the same focus a mother gives to a fevered child. Eyes narrowed, waiting for signs of failure. If the temperature dropped, the iron would cling to the slag and never release. If it rose too fast, the furnace might split or, worse, erupt. And through all of it, your body suffered. The heat burned your face, even with the wet cloth tied around it. Your hands blistered under the gloves, if you were lucky enough to have them. Most of the time, your fingers bled. The tongue slipped. The tools were rough, and when the chunk of raw iron was finally pulled from the furnace, it had to be hammered while still hot. You'd swing heavy mallets down over and over, each strike sending sparks into the dark. You couldn't stop. Not for blood. Not for pain. The iron demanded constant attention, like a living thing that would punish you for hesitation. And yet, there was pride too. Quiet, battered pride. Because this was the beginning. The first step in everything. No plow cut the field, no sword split a shield, no hinge held a door without the iron from your hands. The warriors got the glory, the lords the riches, but it was your sweat and their blades. Your lungs filled with the smoke that made their lives easier. You could walk through the village and see the results of your labor, even if no one said thank you. Even if no one remembered your name. The worst days were when the fire wouldn't behave. When the wind shifted wrong and the furnace cooled, or the charcoal burned too fast and the iron turned brittle. You'd see it in the slag, a dull gray sheen that meant the whole batch was ruined. Hours of work wasted. You'd take a step back, breathe slowly through the soot, and start again. No complaints, no shouting. Just the knowledge that failure was part of the job and pain was part of the rhythm. Sometimes at night, you'd find yourself shaking. Not from fear or exhaustion, but from something else. A kind of deep hum in the bones, the memory of the fire, the echo of hammer on iron. It lived in your limbs, long after the pit had gone dark. You'd wake to find your hands clenched, your jaw tight, the taste of metal still on your tongue. No dreams, just heat, just pressure. And always the knowing that tomorrow you'd do it all again. Not because you wanted to, but because someone had to make the world work. And in this age, when everything bent or broke or burned, it was the men at the smelting pit who held it together with bleeding hands and scorched breath. There was a rhythm to the smelting pit that no one spoke about, but everyone knew. It wasn't marked by the ticking of a clock or the ringing of a bell, but by the way the furnace breathed. It inhaled deeply when the fire rose, exhaled in a hiss when the slag was drawn off. You learned its moods the way a shepherd learns his flock, by feel, by instinct, by the creak of the bellows and the glow on the stone walls. It became a companion of sorts, though not a kind one. It asked for more than it gave, demanded your time, your skin, your patience. And sometimes it punished you just for being near it. The older smelters didn't bother naming it, but a few whispered to it under their breath. Not prayers, not really. More like apologies. When the bloom was ready to be pulled from the furnace, it took at least 3 men to manage it. One worked the tongs, gripping the red-hot mass like it was a chunk of the sun itself. Another swung the hammer to break off the outer shell of slag. The third watched the coals, adjusting the fire to keep the heat steady while the iron cooled just enough to handle without melting tools. Each job was dangerous. The bloom could crumble. The slag could splash, and the fire had no sympathy. A single misstep could burn through leather, through cloth, through flesh. You didn't scream when it happened. Not because you were brave, but because screaming wasted breath. You might need to stay conscious. Some days were worse than others. Days when the wind dropped low and the smoke from the furnace wrapped around the pit like a fog, making it hard to breathe, hard to see. You find yourself working blind, trusting your hands to remember where the tools were, praying you didn't pick up the wrong end of the tongs. There was no stopping, no waiting for the air to clear. The fire didn't care about your lungs. It only cared about staying alive. And if you wanted iron, you had to keep feeding it. The apprentices had it hardest. They were the ones sent to fetch the ore, to stoke the fires, to carry the buckets of water used to quench the glowing iron. Their fingers stayed black no matter how much they scrubbed. Their eyes always red-rimmed from smoke and lack of sleep. One boy, no more than 12, once fell asleep beside the pit. His tunic caught an ember. By the time they put it out, he'd lost most of the hair on his arm and part of his ear. He didn't return the next day. No one blamed him. But no one stopped the work either. At night, after the fire was banked and the tools cleaned, you'd sit by the edge of the pit and let the warmth sink into your bones. It was the only comfort the place offered, residual heat, soaking into joints stiff from swinging a hammer for hours. You didn't talk much. What was there to say? Everyone there had the same blisters, the same aches, the same stories that no one wanted to repeat. So you sat silent, letting the burn fade slowly, listening to the faint pop of coals settling into ash. Food helped, but not much. A bowl of stew, a heel of bread, maybe a slice of onion if you were lucky. You chewed slowly, not for the taste, but because eating too fast after a day like that made your stomach cramp. Your hands shook as you brought the spoon to your mouth, and every cut along your knuckles stung when the salt hit it. Still, you ate. Still, you drank. Still, you got up the next morning and did it all again. The iron you made didn't stay with you. It was taken to the smiths, to the forgers, to men who turned raw metal into tools and weapons. Sometimes you saw your work again, hammered into a blade or a hinge or a plowshare. You recognized the texture, the way the light hit it. It made you proud for a second. Then you remembered that no one else knew. That the man holding the blade didn't know whose hands had bled for it, who had pulled it from the fire and carried it, steaming and heavy, through a winter wind. And maybe that was for the best. No one wanted to remember the pit. It wasn't the kind of place you talked about in stories. There were no victories there. Only sweat, burns, and the smell of things breaking down. It was a place of beginnings, but also of endings. Tools wore out. Men wore out. Even the stones around the furnace chipped and cracked over time, worn down by the same hands that tried to shape them. There were those who left. Men who decided the cost was too high, that their fingers were too stiff, their backs too crooked. They went to farm, or to trade, or to sit by the hearth and tell others how to do the job they could no longer bear. Some stayed longer than they should have. They'd be found slumped beside the pit one morning, their hands curled, their boots melted. No one made a show of it. You dug a hole, said a few words, and went back to the fire, because the iron wouldn't wait. It never did. And in the end, maybe that was what made the smelting pit feel sacred. Not the fire or the ritual or the danger, but the quiet promise it made that as long as you fed it, it would keep going, that as long as your hands moved, the world would keep turning. No one would thank you. No one would sing, but the door would swing open, the sword would strike true. The wheel would turn, and somewhere deep beneath the ash, your work would remain. Unseen, unnamed, but essential. Chapter 10. The Metalworker Who Betrayed a Clan. There are few roles more quietly trusted in a Saxon village than that of the metalworker. While the chieftain led and the warrior fought and the farmer bent his back to the soil, it was the man at the forge who gave shape to the tools that made all of it possible. He stood apart from the others, not higher, not lower, just removed, touched by fire in a way the rest of them were not. He knew the secrets of iron. He understood its moods. He could make things that outlived the people who used them. And for that, he was both respected and feared. When the forge glowed red in the dead of winter, no one asked questions. They simply believed that what was being made was necessary, until the day it wasn't. His name was Ealdric, and his forge was at the southern edge of the settlement, where the land dipped into a quiet hollow, and the trees leaned in close. He had no family, no apprentice. He had arrived one spring with nothing but a cart full of tools and a horse that looked more bone than muscle. He built the forge in 2 days and had smoke curling from the chimney by the third. People were wary at first, as they always were with outsiders, but metal is metal and need is need. His work was clean, precise, efficient. He asked no questions, spoke only when spoken to, and never came to the meat hole. Within a month, every blade and hinge in the village had passed through his hands. Within a season, they stopped calling him the Smith and started calling him our Smith. That was when the trouble began. At first, it was small things. A blade that snapped too easily. A plowshare that cracked under strain. A chain that rusted faster than it should have. People muttered, but Ealdric always offered replacements, always quickly. Always with the quiet calm of a man who knew the world better than you did. Accidents happen, he said. Iron is a living thing. It has its moments. And because he said it with such certainty, people believed him. For a while, then came the incident with the gate. It was a heavy wooden structure bound with 3 iron hinges. The largest ever forged in the village, meant to hold back a pack of wolves that had taken to sniffing the livestock pens at night. The gate held for 3 days. On the 4th, in the middle of a storm, the hinges gave way, clean breaks, no warping, no splintering. Just 3 neat fractures in the iron, as if it had been told to give up. The wolves got in. 2 sheep dead, 1 boy nearly so. And still, Ealdric said nothing, just nodded, made new hinges, and fitted them before dawn. That was when the questions started. Quiet ones, asked behind hands or over empty cups. Where did Ealdric get his ore? Why did he never buy charcoal from the village burners? Why did his fire always seem hot, even when the wind was wrong? Why, when he walked past the grave mound, did the crows always fall silent? The answers came not from the village, but from the forest. A hunting party returned late one evening, pale and shaken. They had stumbled across another forge half collapsed, long dead, but inside, among the ruins. They found a brand still fresh on a fallen beam. It matched the one Ealdric stamped into every blade he made. The problem was, that forge had belonged to a village destroyed a decade earlier, wiped off the map in a raid. No one survived. Or so they thought. The implication was clear. Ealdric hadn't just found an old brand. He had come from that village. The one that had burned. The one whose defenders had fallen, not because they were outnumbered, but because their weapons had broken in their hands. The elders confronted him the next morning. They asked where he came from. He said nothing. They asked where he got his ore. He pointed to the hills. They asked if he had ever forged a blade meant to fail. He looked at them, eyes calm, and said, "No blade fails unless the man holding it forgets why he's holding it." It was the wrong answer, or the right one, said in the wrong way. Either way, it sealed his fate. They didn't kill him. That would have been too easy. And besides, no one wanted to draw blood with a blade he might have made. Instead, they banished him, ordered him to pack his forge, his tools, his strange metals, and leave before nightfall. He did, without protest, without defense. He loaded his cart, led his horse to the edge of the trees, and vanished into the dusk. The village exhaled. The forge was doused. The silence left behind was deep and uneasy. But that wasn't the end. 2 months later, a trader arrived from the east with a wagon full of iron tools, hinges, hooks, nails, blades, all stamped with Ealdric's brand. He said he'd bought them from a man working a forge near the crossroads just past the river. Said the man asked no names, took only coin or copper, and smiled like someone who didn't care if he came back. The villagers said nothing, but no one bought the tools. They burned the forge the next day. Every scrap of iron, every leftover nail, every bucket of ash. They dug out the hearthstone and buried it beneath the grave mound. The smoke from the fire rose high into the clouds, black and bitter. No songs were sung, no stories told, just a slow, uneasy return to normal. But in the years that followed, whenever a blade snapped too cleanly or a nail bent too easily, someone would glance toward the hills and wonder if Ealdric was still out there, making promises in fire and iron, waiting for someone else to forget what he once did. Years passed after Ealdric's exile, but his name was never truly buried. The forge may have been torn apart and the iron scattered into the ground, but what he had done, or what people believed he had done, remained, woven into the breath of every hearthside tale and whispered warning. Children were told not to speak to strangers with soot on their sleeves. Hunters were warned never to accept blades without knowing the hand that shaped them. And every time something broke too soon, an axe that split mid-swing, a hinge that creaked after a week, someone always muttered, not loudly, but just loud enough. Maybe he's back. But the man himself did not return. Not to that village, not to any nearby. Traders brought word of a solitary forge near the marsh border, tended by a man who took payment in raw ore rather than coin, who never asked for names and never gave one. The tools were excellent, better than what most local smiths could manage, but some came home twisted, not visibly, just wrong. A spearhead that felt off balance, a latch that stuck no matter how you oiled it, subtle failures. Mistakes that only revealed themselves when they mattered most, and always, when inspected closely, the faint trace of a maker's mark, scorched instead of stamped 3 crook lines in a circle, not quite touching. It was the elder from the original village, the one who had ordered Ealdric cast out, who finally spoke aloud what many had begun to suspect. That Ealdric hadn't betrayed the village for gold or revenge. He hadn't sold faulty blades or rusted nails because he hated them. He had done it because he believed he was right, that some villages weren't meant to survive, that some people didn't deserve strong doors or sharp swords, and that he alone got to decide which. This idea festered. It clung to people in their sleep. If a man could live among them for months, years even, breaking bread, fixing tools, earning trust, while secretly weakening the very walls that protected their children, then who else might be doing the same? Paranoia spread like frost across a pond. Smiths were questioned more closely. Ores were inspected before being passed to the furnace. Rings were snapped open to check the metal. If a blade broke, the maker was blamed before the user, and the mark of the maker became as important as the sharpness of the edge. Meanwhile, stories of Ealdric's quiet forge continued to reach the edges of nearby settlements. A peddler claimed to have passed a smithy in the woods where no smoke rose, but when he stepped close, he heard hammering steady, distant, like it came from the ground itself. He called out, no one answered. But when he turned away, a knife had appeared in his cart, plain, balanced, Too perfect, he left it behind. A child found it days later and used it to carve an image into a tree, an image that matched the old brand. When the tree was cut that winter, the blade was found embedded in its trunk, rusted through though no rain had touched it. Some said Ealdric was cursed, that he had poured too much of himself into his metal and that it had begun to think for him, that the iron he used remembered who it was meant to fail. One tale described a warband who all fell in a single ambush, not because they were surprised, but because their blades shattered like glass. Only one warrior survived, and when he looked at his blade, he saw the edge curled like a dead leaf. Burned into the handle was that same broken circle brand. The survivor left the battlefield and never carried metal again. He lived out his days weaving baskets. There were efforts to find Ealdric again. Not to punish him, no one expected him to answer to law, but to stop him. A group of young warriors from the north, eager for glory, followed the trail of his rumored forges through 3 regions. They disappeared. Their bodies weren't found. But their weapons, swords, spears, and one axe were recovered in a ruined smithy months later, neatly stacked beside the hearth. Each bore the original maker's mark, scrub it out, and replaced with that same crooked brand, scorched deep into the metal. That was when people stopped looking. Or rather, stopped saying they were. If anyone went to the woods after that, they did it alone, and never bragged about it. They didn't bring torches. They didn't speak his name. It was said that Ealdric still made things, not for people, but for the act itself. That he forged blades and buried them, forged nails and drove them into trees. That he made keys for locks that didn't exist yet. That his iron was no longer meant to help or to harm, but to wait. For what? No one knew. And over time, the idea of him became something else entirely. A symbol, not a man. A reminder that trust in tools is trust in people, and that both can fail without warning. Young smiths were told his story not as a warning about malice, but about the danger of secrecy. That once you decide to work alone, to answer to no one, you become something else, not a craftsman, not even a man. Just fire and shape and silence. Still, the mark showed up now and then, on an arrowhead found in a fallen tree, on a broken hinge unearthed from a collapsed church, on a lock that no key could open, always faint, always just enough to remind you that he hadn't vanished, that somewhere out there, Ealdric was still working, still deciding who deserved strong blades, and who didn't. Chapter 11, The Anvil That Held the Curse. It didn't take long for rumors of the cursed anvil to seep beyond the abandoned village. Traders brought the tale to distant hamlets, where it was passed from hearth to hearth like a scrap of charred parchment, half believed, half mocked, and never quite forgotten. They spoke of the Deep One not as an object, but as a force, something ancient and unkind, perhaps even older than the forge that crowned it. Smiths in far-off towns scoffed at the idea, of course. An anvil couldn't think. Metal didn't remember, but they still burned sage when they cast their first mold. They still refused to work alone at night. And none of them, not one, ever struck a hammer more than twice on an unfamiliar anvil without spitting over their shoulder at first. The obsession with the Deep One eventually drew the wrong sort of attention. One spring, a nobleman with more ambition than sense, Aldred of Clun, sent a group of hired men to retrieve the anvil. He had heard that iron from it never dulled, that blades born there could carve through mail like cloth. What he hadn't heard or had chosen to ignore was the price. The men arrived in the hollow where the forge once stood, now overgrown and eerily quiet. They cleared the brambles, found the ruined walls, and broke through the iron-banded door with little effort. And there it was, still sitting in the center of the forge, clean and untouched, as though waiting. They tried to move it. It wouldn't budge. They brought in ropes, pulleys, a team of oxen. The stone cracked beneath their boots, but the anvil held. One of them, a veteran with more scars than stories, suggested they just leave it. Said he felt a pressure behind his eyes whenever he looked at it. But Aldred had paid them to return with the thing, and they weren't about to disappoint a man who hanged lake couriers from trees. So they tried again. They built a platform, poured oil into the cracks, brought in fresh teams. And this time, slowly, with groans and curses and too much sweat for a cool day, the anvil shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. That was when the first man collapsed. No wound, no cry. Just a grunt and then silence. They carried him out and continued. Another fell, then another. By the time they loaded the anvil into the cart, 3 men were dead and 2 more too dazed to speak. Still, the cart rolled on, pulled by 4 oxen and guarded by silence. No birds, no wind, no talk among the men. Just the sound of wheels on dirt and the quiet hum of something ancient and awake in the cart behind them. They reached Clun 4 days later. The anvil was set up in the nobleman's private forge. A grand affair lined with white stone and staffed by smiths who had never seen true war. Aldred ordered a ceremonial sword to be made from it, a gift for his son, who was to marry into a rival family. The smith struck the first blow. The ring of hammer on anvil was like a bell inside the skull. His assistant dropped the tongs and fled. The second strike brought a strange heat to the forge, one that didn't come from the coals. The third caused every window in the manor to crack. But the sword began to take shape. It was finished in 3 days. Slim, gleaming, perfectly balanced. A blade fit for a prince. Aldred held it up, smiled, and called for wine. That evening, at the feast, he presented it to his son before the assembled lords and ladies. The boy took it with reverence, raised it high and screamed, dropped it, held his hand as if it were on fire. There was no mark, no blood, no burn, but his fingers curled as if gripped by something unseen. He didn't speak for the rest of the night, nor the rest of his life. Aldred ordered the sword destroyed. His guards tried. It would not break, not with hammer, nor axe, nor fire. He ordered it buried. His steward did so. When they checked the next morning, it was back on the table where the boy had dropped it. It hadn't moved. It had returned. That night, the forge caught fire. No cause, no lightning, no spark, just sudden flames. It burned fast, too fast, and the only thing left untouched in the ash was the anvil, not even scorched. Just sitting clean, cold, ready. The manor never recovered. The boy died a year later, never having spoken again. Aldred went mad trying to sell the anvil, to gift it, to give it away. No one would take it. No cart could carry it more than a mile before breaking. And anyone who worked it, even once, seemed to vanish inside themselves, like the first smith who'd set it. Eventually, the forge was rebuilt with stone and sealed shut. The anvil was left inside, behind iron doors bolted with copper, and blessed with every charm the priest knew. They say it still hums sometimes, when the moon is wrong. That if you press your ear to the door, you'll hear hammering, and if you stay too long, you'll forget who you are. No one goes near it now. The manor is ruins, the name of Aldred all but erased from local memory. But the story remains. Not in books, not on maps. In the muttered warnings of smiths, in the silence of broken forges, in the way every village, no matter how small, keeps one anvil they never touch. Just in case. Because maybe the deep one isn't alone, maybe there are others, and maybe they're waiting for the right hands. Or the wrong ones. Chapter 13. The Child Apprentice Who Vanished. There was once a forge on the edge of the marshlands, not far from where the soil turned black and sucked at boots, where the mist clung low all year and the air smelled faintly of iron and mold. It wasn't a large forge, nor a particularly well-known one, but its master had a reputation. Ulrich, they called him. Not for kindness or generosity, but for precision. His blades were thin and fast, his nails so exact that even rival carpenters paid him grudging respect. He spoke little and demanded less, save for silence while working tools kept sharp. He'd lived alone for years until one day, a child appeared at his door. No one saw where the boy had come from. Some claimed he'd washed in with the fog. Others said he was a lord's bastard, sent away under threat. He didn't speak, not at first. But he watched closely, and Ulrich, after a long silence, of him stay. The villagers didn't interfere. They had their suspicions, as small towns often do, but Ulrich's forge kept their tools whole, their hinges smooth, and their livestock shod. Whatever arrangement had been made was not their business. The boy, later called Wolf, soon became a fixture. He fetched water, pumped the bellows, watched the coals with a seriousness that unsettled grown men. Within months, Ulrich had begun to let him shape scrap metal into wire or bend old nails into new hooks. His hands, though small, moved with uncanny steadiness. And when he finally spoke, it was to ask a single question: why does iron hum? Ulrich didn't answer, not directly. But from then on, he taught more deliberately. He began to speak while he worked, naming each step aloud, describing the feel of heat and the tone of a cooling blade. The boy absorbed it all. Not just the words, but the rhythm. Soon, Wolf was crafting trinkets, simple buckles, fishhooks, the occasional clasp. His lines were clean, his joints smooth. Ulrich never praised him, but he didn't correct him much either. One winter night, a traveler came through the village, an old tinker with a wagon full of junk and stories. He asked about the forge. When told the boy worked there now, his expression turned grave. He said nothing more, but the next morning he left a pouch of rusted keys at the inn and vanished. The innkeeper, curious, brought them to Ulrich, who examined each in turn before selecting one and tossing the rest into the hearth. The boy watched all this without blinking. That night the forge glowed blue, and the trees near the marsh swayed, though there was no wind. That spring, strange things began to happen. Horses wouldn't walk past the forge unless blindfolded. A midwife claimed her iron scissors had bent in her hands after passing the smithy. And once, during a storm, a bolt of lightning struck the anvil and split not the metal, but the air itself, leaving a scar on the wood beam above it. Ulrich boarded it up, but Wolf stared at it for days. The villagers began to whisper again. They said the boy had no shadow when he worked, that he'd begun to speak in old words, strange ones, not Saxon nor Latin nor anything known. One man swore he saw the boy shaping a blade that was already red hot, though the forge hadn't been lit in hours. Another claimed the lad walked across the marsh barefoot, never sinking. Of course, such stories often grow wild in quiet places. But what happened next turned whispers into fear. Wolf vanished. One morning he was there, stoking the coals. That evening he was gone. The forge was untouched. Ulrich said nothing. He kept working, as though the boy had never existed. When asked, he'd pause, stare, then return to his anvil. For weeks, villagers checked the marsh, searched the woods, even dredged the old creek. Nothing. No prints, no clothes. No body. Just silence. Then came the letters. Not written letters, but shapes etched into metal. A farmer found one on the underside of a plow. A tiny rune scratched deep into the iron. A shepherd spotted another on his shears. The innkeeper's key, long unused, turned blue and bore a spiral that hadn't been there before. The village priest, half blind but no fool, insisted the marks matched those used in ancient charms. Protection wards, perhaps, or traps. No one could be sure. They returned to Ulrich, demanded answers. He hammered a blade as they shouted, never looking up. Finally he spoke. He went where iron listens. And then, with a sharp twist, he broke the blade in two and dropped both halves into the quench. The water hissed but never steamed. The forge shut down a month later. Ulrich left a note nailed to the door with a square-headed rivet. It read, "The apprentice was the forge, I was the bellows. We both are empty now." No one ever saw him again. But travelers still speak of a boy wandering the marsh paths, barefoot, eyes bright as coals, offering knives in exchange for names. Not money, just names. When asked what he does with them, he says, "Iron needs to remember." There was once a forge on the edge of the marshlands, not far from where the soil turned black and sucked at boots, where the mist clung low all year and the air smelled faintly of iron and mold. It wasn't a large forge, nor a particularly well-known one, but its master had a reputation. Ulrich, they called him. Not for kindness or generosity, but for precision. He asked about the forge. When told the boy worked there now, his expression turned grave. A midwife claimed her iron scissors had bent in her hands after passing the smithy. And once, during a storm, A bolt of lightning struck the anvil and split not the metal, but the air itself, leaving a scar in the wood beam above it. The forge was untouched. Ulrich said nothing. He kept working, as though the boy had never existed. A farmer found one on the underside of a plow, a tiny rune scratched deep into the iron. A shepherd spotted another on his shears. The innkeeper's key, long unused, turned blue and bore a spiral that hadn't been there before. The village priest, half blind but no fool, insisted the marks matched those used in ancient charms. Protection wards, perhaps, or traps, no one could be sure. When asked, he'd pause, stare, then return to his anvil. For weeks, villagers checked the marsh, searched the woods, even dredged the old creek. Nothing. No prints, no clothes, no body. Just silence. Ulrich boarded it up, but Wolf stared at it for days. He said nothing more, but the next morning, he left a pouch of rusted keys at the inn and vanished. They said the boy had no shadow when he worked, that he'd begun to speak in old words, strange ones, not Saxon or Latin or anything known. One man swore he saw the boy shaping a blade that was already red hot, though the forge hadn't been lit in hours. He hammered a blade as they shouted, never looking up. Finally he spoke. He went where iron listens. And then, with a sharp twist, he broke the blade into and dropped both halves into the quench. The water hissed but never steamed. Another claimed the lad walked across the marsh barefoot, never sinking. Ulrich left a note nailed to the door with a square-headed rivet. It read, "The apprentice was the forge. I was the bellows. We both are empty now." No one ever saw him again. But travelers still speak of a boy wandering the marsh paths, barefoot, eyes bright as coals, offering knives in exchange for names. Not money, just names. When asked what he does with them, he says, "Iron needs to remember." Of course, such stories often grow wild in quiet places. But what happened next turned whispers into fear. The innkeeper, curious, brought them to Ulrich, who examined each in turn before selecting one and tossing the rest into the hearth. The boy watched all this without blinking. That night the forge glowed blue, and the trees near the marsh swayed, though there was no wind. His blades were thin and fast, his nails so exact that even rival carpenters paid him grudging respect. He spoke little and demanded less, save for silence while working and tools kept sharp. He'd lived alone for years until one day, a child appeared at his door. No one saw where the boy had come from. Some claimed he'd washed in with the fog. Others said he was a lord's bastard, sent away under threat. He didn't speak, not at first. But he watched closely, and Ulrich, after a long silence of his own, let him stay. The villagers didn't interfere. They had their suspicions, as small towns often do, but Ulrich's forge kept their tools whole, their hinges smooth, and their livestock shod. He began to speak while he worked, naming each step aloud, describing the feel of heat and the tone of a cooling blade. The boy absorbed it all, not just the words, but the rhythm. Soon, Wolf was crafting trinkets, simple buckles, fish hooks, the occasional clasp. His lines were clean, his joins smooth. Ulrich never praised him, but he didn't correct him much either. Whatever arrangement had been made was not their business. The boy later called Wolf soon became a fixture. He fetched water, pumped the bellows, watched the coals with a seriousness that unsettled grown men. Within months, Ulrich had begun to let him shape scrap metal into wire or bend old nails into new hooks. His hands, though small, moved with uncanny steadiness. And when he finally spoke, it was to ask a single question. Why does iron hum? Ulrich didn't answer, not directly. But from then on, he taught more deliberately. One winter night, a traveler came through the village, an old tinker with a wagon full of junk and stories. That spring, strange things began to happen. Horses wouldn't walk past the forge unless blindfolded. The villagers began to whisper again. Wolf vanished. One morning he was there, stoking the coals. That evening he was gone. Then came the letters. Not written letters, but shapes etched into metal. They returned to Ulrich, demanded answers. The forge shut down a month later. Chapter 11. The Anvil That Held a Curse. It didn't take long for rumors of the cursed anvil to seep beyond the abandoned village. Traders brought the tale to distant hamlets. where it was passed from hearth to hearth like a scrap of charred parchment, half believed, half mocked, and never quite forgotten. They spoke of the Deep One not as an object, but as a force, something ancient and unkind, perhaps even older than the forge that crowned it. Smiths in far-off towns scoffed at the idea, of course. An anvil couldn't think. Metal didn't remember, but they still burned sage when they cast their first mold. They still refused to work alone at night. And none of them, not one, ever struck a hammer more than twice on an unfamiliar anvil without spitting over their shoulder at first. The obsession with the Deep One eventually drew the wrong sort of attention. One spring, a nobleman with more ambition than sense, Aldred of Clun, sent a group of hired men to retrieve the anvil. He had heard that iron from it never dulled, that blades born there could carve through mail like cloth. What he hadn't heard or had chosen to ignore was the price. The men arrived in the hollow where the forge once stood, now overgrown and eerily quiet. They cleared the brambles, found the ruined walls, and broke through the iron-banded door with little effort. And there it was, still sitting in the center of the forge, clean and untouched, as though waiting. They tried to move it. It wouldn't budge. They brought in ropes, pulleys, a team of oxen. The stone cracked beneath their boots, but the anvil held. One of them, a veteran with more scars than stories, suggested they just leave it. Said he felt a pressure behind his eyes whenever he looked at it. But Aldred had paid them to return with the thing, and they weren't about to disappoint a man who hanged lake couriers from trees. So they tried again. They built a platform, poured oil into the cracks, brought in fresh teams. And this time, slowly, with groans and curses and too much sweat for a cool day, the anvil shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. That was when the first man collapsed. No wound, no cry. Just a grunt and then silence. They carried him out and continued. Another fell, then another. By the time they loaded the anvil into the cart, 3 men were dead and 2 more too dazed to speak. Still, the cart rolled on, pulled by 4 oxen and guarded by silence. No birds, no wind, no talk among the men. Just the sound of wheels on dirt and the quiet hum of something ancient and awake in the cart behind them. They reached Clun 4 days later. The anvil was set up in the nobleman's private forge. A grand affair lined with white stone and staffed by smiths who had never seen true war. Aldred ordered a ceremonial sword to be made from it, a gift for his son, who was to marry into a rival family. The smith struck the first blow. The ring of hammer on anvil was like a bell inside the skull. His assistant dropped the tongs and fled. The second strike brought a strange heat to the forge, one that didn't come from the coals. The third caused every window in the manor to crack. But the sword began to take shape. It was finished in 3 days. Slim, gleaming, perfectly balanced. A blade fit for a prince. Aldred held it up, smiled, and called for wine. That evening, at the feast, he presented it to his son before the assembled lords and ladies. The boy took it with reverence, raised it high and screamed, dropped it, held his hand as if it were on fire. There was no mark, no blood, no burn, but his fingers curled as if gripped by something unseen. He didn't speak for the rest of the night, nor the rest of his life. Aldred ordered the sword destroyed. His guards tried. It would not break, not with hammer nor axe nor fire. He ordered it buried. His steward did so. When they checked the next morning, it was back on the table where the boy had dropped it. It hadn't moved. It had returned. That night, the forge caught fire. No cause, no lightning, no spark, just sudden flames. It burned fast, too fast, and the only thing left untouched in the ash was the anvil, not even scorched. Just sitting clean, cold, ready. The manor never recovered. The boy died a year later, never having spoken again. Aldred went mad trying to sell the anvil, to gift it, to give it away. No one would take it. No cart could carry it more than a mile before breaking. And anyone who worked it, even once, seemed to vanish inside themselves, like the first smith who'd set it. Eventually, the forge was rebuilt with stone and sealed shut. The anvil was left inside, behind iron doors bolted with copper, and blessed with every charm the priest knew. They say it still hums sometimes when the moon is wrong. That if you press your ear to the door, you'll hear hammering. And if you stay too long, you'll forget who you are. No one goes near it now. The manor is ruins, the name of Aldred all but erased from local memory. But the story remains. Not in books, not on maps. In the muttered warnings of smiths, in the silence of broken forges, in the way every village, no matter how small, keeps one anvil they never touch. Just in case. Because maybe the deep one isn't alone, maybe there are others. And maybe they're waiting for the right hands. Or the wrong ones. Chapter 13. The Child Apprentice Who Vanished. There was once a forge on the edge of the marshlands, not far from where the soil turned black and sucked at boots, where the mist clung low all year and the air smelled faintly of iron and mold. It wasn't a large forge, nor a particularly well-known one, but its master had a reputation. Ulrich, they called him. Not for kindness or generosity, but for precision. His blades were thin and fast, his nails so exact that even rival carpenters paid him grudging respect. He spoke little and demanded less, save for silence while working tools kept sharp. He'd lived alone for years until one day, a child appeared at his door. No one saw where the boy had come from. Some claimed he'd washed in with the fog. Others said he was a lord's bastard, sent away under threat. He didn't speak, not at first. But he watched closely, and Ulrich, after a long silence of him stay. The villagers didn't interfere. They had their suspicions, as small towns often do, but Ulrich's forge kept their tools whole, their hinges smooth, and their livestock shod. Whatever arrangement had been made was not their business. The boy later called Wolf soon became a fixture. He fetched water, pumped the bellows, watched the coals with a seriousness that unsettled grown men. Within months, Ulrich had begun to let him shape scrap metal into wire or bend old nails into new hooks. His hands, though small, moved with uncanny steadiness. And when he finally spoke, it was to ask a single question: why does iron hum? Ulrich didn't answer, not directly. But from then on, he taught more deliberately. He began to speak while he worked, naming each step aloud, describing the feel of heat and the tone of a cooling blade. The boy absorbed it all. Not just the words, but the rhythm. Soon, Wolf was crafting trinkets, simple buckles, fishhooks, the occasional clasp. His lines were clean. His joints smooth. Ulrich never praised him. But he didn't correct him much either. One winter night, a traveler came through the village, an old tinker with a wagon full of junk and stories. He asked about the forge. When told the boy worked there now, his expression turned grave. He said nothing more, but the next morning he left a pouch of rusted keys at the inn and vanished. The innkeeper, curious, brought them to Ulrich, who examined each in turn before selecting one and tossing the rest into the hearth. The boy watched all this without blinking. That night the forge glowed blue, and the trees near the marsh swayed though there was no wind. That spring, strange things began to happen. Horses wouldn't walk past the forge unless blindfolded. A midwife claimed her iron scissors had bent in her hands after passing the smithy. And once, during a storm, a bolt of lightning struck the anvil and split not the metal, but the air itself, leaving a scar on the wood beam above it. Ulrich boarded it up. But Wolf stared at it for days. The villagers began to whisper again. They said the boy had no shadow when he worked, that he began to speak in old words, strange ones, not Saxon nor Latin nor anything known. One man swore he saw the boy shaping a blade that was already red hot, though the forge hadn't been lit in hours. Another claimed the lad walked across the marsh barefoot, never sinking. Of course, such stories often grow wild in quiet places, but what happened next turned whispers into fear. Wolf vanished. One morning he was there, stoking the coals. That evening he was gone. The forge was untouched. Ulrich said nothing. He kept working, as though the boy had never existed. When asked, he'd pause, stare, then return to his anvil. For weeks, villagers checked the marsh, searched the woods, even dredged the old creek. Nothing. No prints, no clothes. No body. Just silence. Then came the letters. Not written letters, but shapes etched into metal. A farmer found one on the underside of a plow. A tiny rune scratched deep into the iron. A shepherd spotted another on his shears. The innkeeper's key, long unused, turned blue and bore a spiral that hadn't been there before. The village priest, half blind but no fool, insisted the marks matched those used in ancient charms. Protection wards, perhaps, or traps. No one could be sure. They returned to Ulrich, demanded answers. He hammered a blade as they shouted, never looking up. Finally he spoke. He went where iron listened. And then, with a sharp twist, he broke the blade in two and dropped both halves into the quench. The water hissed but never steamed. The forge shut down a month later. Ulrich left a note nailed to the door with a square-headed rivet. It read, "The apprentice was the forge, I was the bellows. We both are empty now." No one ever saw him again. But travelers still speak of a boy wandering the marsh paths, barefoot, eyes bright as coals, offering knives in exchange for names. Not money, just names. When asked what he does with them, he says, "Iron needs to remember." There was once a forge on the edge of the marshlands, not far from where the soil turned black and sucked at boots, where the mist clung low all year and the air smelled faintly of iron and mold. It wasn't a large forge, nor a particularly well-known one, but its master had a reputation. Ulrich, they called him. Not for kindness or generosity, but for precision. He asked about the forge. When told the boy worked there now, his expression turned grave. A midwife claimed her iron scissors had bent in her hands after passing the smithy. And once, during a storm, a bolt of lightning struck the anvil and split not the metal, but the air itself, leaving a scar in the wood beam above it. The forge was untouched. Ulrich said nothing. He kept working, as though the boy had never existed. A farmer found one on the underside of a plow. A tiny rune scratched deep into the iron. A shepherd spotted another on his shears. The innkeeper's key, long unused, turned blue and bore a spiral that hadn't been there before. The village priest, half blind but no fool, insisted the marks matched those used in ancient charms. Protection wards, perhaps, or traps, no one could be sure. When asked, he'd pause, stare, then return to his anvil. For weeks, villagers checked the marsh, searched the woods, even dredged the old creek. Nothing. No prints, no clothes, no body. Just silence. Ulrich boarded it up, but Wolf stared at it for days. He said nothing more, but the next morning, he left a pouch of rusted keys at the inn and vanished. They said the boy had no shadow when he worked, that he'd begun to speak in old words, strange ones, not Saxon or Latin or anything known. One man swore he saw the boy shaping a blade that was already red hot, though the forge hadn't been lit in hours. He hammered a blade as they shouted, never looking up. Finally he spoke. He went where iron listens. And then, with a sharp twist, he broke the blade in two and dropped both halves into the quench. The water hissed but never steamed. Another claimed the lad walked across the marsh barefoot, never sinking. Ulrich left a note nailed to the door with a square-headed rivet. It read, "The apprentice was the forge. I was the bellows. We both are empty now." No one ever saw him again. But travelers still speak of a boy wandering the marsh paths, barefoot, eyes bright as coals, offering knives in exchange for names. Not money, just names. When asked what he does with them, he says, "Iron needs to remember." Of course, such stories often grow wild in quiet places. But what happened next turned whispers into fear. The innkeeper, curious, brought them to Ulrich, who examined each in turn before selecting one and tossing the rest into the hearth. The boy watched all this without blinking. That night, the forge glowed blue, and the trees near the marsh swayed, though there was no wind. His blades were thin and fast, his nails so exact that even rival carpenters paid him grudging respect. He spoke little and demanded less, save for silence while working and tools kept sharp. He'd lived alone for years until one day, a child appeared at his door. No one saw where the boy had come from. Some claimed he'd washed in with the fog. Others said he was a lord's bastard, sent away under threat. He didn't speak, not at first. But he watched closely, and Ulrich, after a long silence of his own, let him stay. The villagers didn't interfere. They had their suspicions, as small towns often do, but Ulrich's forge kept their tools whole, their hinges smooth, and their livestock shod. He began to speak while he worked, naming each step aloud, describing the feel of heat and the tone of a cooling blade. The boy absorbed it all, not just the words, but the rhythm. Soon, Wolf was crafting trinkets, simple buckles, fish hooks, the occasional clasp. His lines were clean, his joins smooth. Ulrich never praised him, but he didn't correct him much either. Whatever arrangement had been made was not their business. The boy later called Wolf soon became a fixture. He fetched water, pumped the bellows, watched the coals with a seriousness that unsettled grown men. Within months, Ulrich had begun to let him shape scrap metal into wire or bend old nails into new hooks. His hands, though small, moved with uncanny steadiness. And when he finally spoke, it was to ask a single question. Why does iron hum? Ulrich didn't answer, not directly. But from then on, he taught more deliberately. One winter night, a traveler came through the village, an old tinker with a wagon full of junk and stories. That spring, strange things began to happen. Horses wouldn't walk past the forge unless blindfolded. The villagers began to whisper again. Wolf vanished. One morning he was there, stoking the coals. That evening he was gone. Then came the letters. Not written letters, but shapes etched into metal. They returned to Ulrich, demanded answers. The forge shut down a month later. Chapter 12, The Feast of Bone, Metal, and Boar. In the cold stone halls of the northern Saxon chieftains, the clang of hammers wasn't the only music of power. Feasting was its own kind of ritual, just as loud, just as structured, and just as necessary for keeping order. The long hall was the kingdom's stomach, and what happened there often carried more weight than the dealings of the forge. But on certain nights, rare and whispered about, a strange union of both worlds took place. The Feast of Bone, Metal, and Boar. It was not a tradition shared broadly across the land, but a local custom from one of the more reclusive hill clans, whose wealth came not from grain or raiding, but from their forges. This was a night to show that wealth. Not in coin, not in words, but in what they could make and what they could eat. The feasting hall itself was carved partly into the hill, with wooden beams blackened by age and smoke. The stone tables rubbed smooth by elbows and spilt broth bore shallow carvings of swords, hammers, and the spiral patterns favored by their smiths. On the night of the feast, every fire roared, not just for warmth or spectacle, but to soften the metal cutlery used only for this occasion, knives and skewers forged from a copper-iron alloy, oddly brittle if cooled too fast, but known for keeping a razor edge. The guests were expected to use these to carve their own meat, and in doing so, demonstrate both etiquette and control. Blunt a blade or break a skewer, and it was considered a grave insult to the smiths who had made them. More than one guest had left such a feast with nothing in hand and a reputation in pieces. But it was the center of the hall that drew the most awe, the roast boar, its tusks inlaid with bronze wire, its flanks skewered with ornate rods shaped like broken swords, each a replica of a weapon once shattered in battle. The animal was enormous, slow cooked for a full day in a fire pit lined with blackened stones and drizzled in a glaze made from honey, fermented barley, and something that smelled faintly of iron. The chieftain would rise, always with a goblet in one hand and a pair of thick iron carving tools in the other. These were his alone. Not for show, but for tradition. Passed down, not sharpened. Dull but heavy. He would make the first cut, not a slice, but a break, twisting a rib, loose with a crunch, and holding it up like a prize. No one ate until he dropped it onto his own plate. Around him, the guests would begin their own carving, using the thin metal knives and bone-handled tools laid out beside each dish. The chatter was low, reverent. Too loud, and it meant disrespect. Too quiet, and it meant fear. Everyone, even those who had never touched an anvil, treated the meal as a kind of forge, the meat, the metal, the motion, all reflecting back the hall's spirit. Jokes would come later, after the marrow had been scraped and the blood sausages passed down the line. What made this feast different from any other was the second course, the tools themselves. Not the knives or plates, but small forged items placed at each seat. wrapped in coarse linen. Guests would open theirs in unison. One year, it was a tiny spearhead with no socket, designed to fit no shaft. Another year, a round brooch made to resemble a shield, but with the clasp on the wrong side. These were not gifts. They were puzzles. Each guest was expected to interpret their item's meaning and present it in a toast. If your brooch looked backward, perhaps it meant you needed to stop turning your back in council. If your spear had no shaft, perhaps it meant your arguments lacked support. It was part craftsmanship, part insult, part compliment. The best forges in the clan prepared these objects, and the game was to understand the message without taking offense, or to pretend you did, even if you didn't. One season, a neighboring chieftain arrived uninvited, eager to make peace after a long border dispute. He brought mead, a harp player, and his most trusted smith. But when the parcels were unwrapped, his held nothing. Just linen, folded tight and warm from the fire, but empty. Silence followed. The host chieftain said nothing. The guest turned pale. He stood without eating, bowed, and left without a word. No songs were played that night. The harp was returned the next morning, strings unplucked. These feasts were not for the faint-hearted. Beneath the meat and ale, they were about metal and memory, about forging relationships as carefully as blades. The clan believed that a man who could not interpret a knife's balance had no place in a council, and a woman who could not spot a flaw in her fork's weld should not whisper into war plans. Even children were given hollow rings to test their eyes, to teach them to look twice at things that seemed full. Over time, the feasts of bone metal and boar became rarer. As clans merged or disappeared, as wars replaced dances and peace was bought with coin rather than words, the tradition thinned like beaten copper. But in some corners of the north, where the winds still howl low and forges glow red through the trees, there are rumors it still happens. Not yearly, but when needed. When an insult runs too deep for words, or when a treaty requires more than wax and signature. There's an old saying that comes from those halls, passed quietly among smiths. The sharpest cut is the one served warm. They don't mean violence. They mean the way a meal can reveal a man. The way a blade on a table, untouched but gleaming, can say more than any speech. And the way, even now, metal finds its way to the center of every human story, hidden inside laughter and roast boar, waiting for the right hands to carve meaning from it. It didn't take long for rumors of the cursed anvil to seep beyond the abandoned village. Traders brought the tale to distant hamlets, where it was passed from hearth to hearth like a scrap of charred parchment, half believed, half mocked, and never quite forgotten. They spoke of the Deep One not as an object, but as a force, something ancient and unkind, perhaps even older than the forge that crowned it. Smiths in far-off towns scoffed at the idea, of course. An anvil couldn't think. Metal didn't remember, but they still burned sage when they cast their first mold. They still refused to work alone at night. And none of them, not one, ever struck a hammer more than twice on an unfamiliar anvil without spitting over their shoulder at first. The obsession with the Deep One eventually drew the wrong sort of attention. One spring, a nobleman with more ambition than sense, Aldred of Clun, sent a group of hired men to retrieve the anvil. He had heard that iron from it never dulled, that blades born there could carve through mail like cloth. What he hadn't heard or had chosen to ignore was the price. The men arrived in the hollow where the forge once stood, now overgrown and eerily quiet. They cleared the brambles, found the ruined walls, and broke through the iron-banded door with little effort. And there it was, still sitting in the center of the forge, clean and untouched, as though waiting. They tried to move it. It wouldn't budge. They brought in ropes, pulleys, a team of oxen. The stone cracked beneath their boots, but the anvil held. One of them, a veteran with more scars than stories, suggested they just leave it. Said he felt a pressure behind his eyes whenever he looked at it. But Aldred had paid them to return with the thing, and they weren't about to disappoint a man who hanged lake couriers from trees. So they tried again. They built a platform, poured oil into the cracks, brought in fresh teams. And this time, slowly, with groans and curses and too much sweat for a cool day, The anvil shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. That was when the first man collapsed. No wound, no cry. Just a grunt and then silence. They carried him out and continued. Another fell, then another. By the time they loaded the anvil into the cart, 3 men were dead and 2 more too dazed to speak. Still, the cart rolled on, pulled by 4 oxen and guarded by silence. No birds, no wind, no talk among the men. Just the sound of wheels on dirt and the quiet hum of something ancient and awake in the cart behind them. They reached Clun 4 days later. The anvil was set up in the nobleman's private forge. A grand affair lined with white stone and staffed by smiths who had never seen true war. Aldred ordered a ceremonial sword to be made from it, a gift for his son, who was to marry into a rival family. The smith struck the first blow. The ring of hammer on anvil was like a bell inside the skull. His assistant dropped the tongs and fled. The second strike brought a strange heat to the forge, one that didn't come from the coals. The third caused every window in the manor to crack. But the sword began to take shape. It was finished in 3 days. Slim, gleaming, perfectly balanced. A blade fit for a prince. Aldred held it up, smiled, and called for wine. That evening, at the feast, he presented it to his son before the assembled lords and ladies. The boy took it with reverence, raised it high and screamed, dropped it, held his hand as if it were on fire. There was no mark, no blood, no burn, but his fingers curled as if gripped by something unseen. He didn't speak for the rest of the night, nor the rest of his life. Aldred ordered the sword destroyed. His guards tried. It would not break, not with hammer, nor axe, nor fire. He ordered it buried. His steward did so. When they checked the next morning, it was back on the table where the boy had dropped it. It hadn't moved. It had returned. That night, the forge caught fire. No cause, no lightning, no spark, just sudden flames. It burned fast, too fast, and the only thing left untouched in the ash was the anvil, not even scorched. Just sitting clean, cold, ready. The manor never recovered. The boy died a year later, never having spoken again. Aldred went mad trying to sell the anvil, to give it away. No one would take it. No cart could carry it more than a mile before breaking. And anyone who worked it, even once, seemed to vanish inside themselves, like the first smith who'd said it. Eventually, the forge was rebuilt with stone and sealed shut. The anvil was left inside, behind iron doors bolted with copper, and blessed with every charm the priest knew. They say it still hums sometimes, when the moon is wrong. That if you press your ear to the door, you'll hear hammering. And if you stay too long, you'll forget who you are. No one goes near it now. The manor is ruins, the name of Aldred all but erased from local memory. But the story remains. Not in books, not on maps. In the muttered warnings of smiths, in the silence of broken forges, in the way every village, no matter how small, keeps one anvil they never touch. Just in case. Because maybe the deep one isn't alone. Maybe there are others. And maybe they're waiting for the right hands. Or the wrong ones. Though the official feast may have ended with the last clank of tankards and the slumped shoulders of overeaten warriors. The true work of the evening began only after the flames died down to embers. Once the high tables had been cleared, and the children set to bed, the inner circle remained. Chieftains, smiths, a few trusted advisors, and the occasional druid or seer whose presence suggested that something larger was being forged than iron. What happened during these late hours was rarely recorded, and never discussed openly, but its consequences often echoed louder than any blade drawn in daylight. Beneath the table, beneath the laughter, alliances were tempered, grudges were scored, and futures were cast like glowing metal into molds no one outside the hall would ever see. The smiths played a curious role in these after-feasts. Most weren't warriors, and fewer still were lords, but here they stood nearly equal. A good blade could win a battle, but a blade with a name crafted by a known hand, wrapped in a story, blessed with a memory, could win a war before it began. So the smiths were consulted, not just on steel, but on strategy. What kind of metal held up best in the damp southlands? Which forging techniques lasted longest when edge met chainmail? Could a blade be made to ring louder on impact, to demoralize rather than simply kill? These weren't idle questions. They were the difference between losing 10 men and 100. Between a skirmish and a legacy, it was also a time for judgment. The feast may have given every guest a mysterious object wrapped in cloth, but what the recipients said about it, how they interpreted it, was remembered carefully. The smiths would watch closely. If a warrior misread his gift or laughed too hard at someone else's meaning, it might suggest vanity. If a chieftain grew silent or defensive, perhaps the steel had struck closer than expected. The objects were simple, but they held weight, and they were recorded quietly in the minds of those who mattered. A badly delivered toast could cost you a marriage alliance. A clever one might earn you the offer of an apprentice trained at the finest forge in the region. Then came the final act of the night, known in hushed voices as the bone forge. It was not a literal forge, though it involved fire and ash. A tray was passed, an old iron sheet with a raised rim, dented from years of use. On it were bones from the feast. Boar ribs, bird legs, sometimes deer. Each was stripped clean, then carved hastily with a blade provided by the head smith. The guests were instructed to etch a symbol into the bone, no larger than a thumbnail, a rune, a shape, a simple message. They were not told why, only that they must. The tray would pass from hand to hand, and the bones returned. In the morning, it would be buried in a pit beneath the forge hearth, mixed with old slag and cinders. No one ever saw the bones again. But everyone remembered what they had carved. Some believed the ritual was symbolic, meant to bind the feast's energy into the forge itself. Others thought it was a kind of insurance, ensuring that what had been said and done would stay quiet, burned into secrecy. A few whispered darker things, that the bones absorbed not memory, but guilt. That carving them was a kind of confession, and that the forge knew what had been done. Regardless of the truth, no one ever refused. To deny the bone forge was to admit fear. And in those halls, fear was the 1 cent worse than treason. There were accidents, of course. The edge of the ritual blade was sharp, and more than one guest had sliced their palm in the process. But even this, oddly, became part of a tradition. Blood on bone was seen as potent, though no one said why. When it happened, no one spoke. They just nodded slowly, as if to mark that something important had occurred. One such guest, a young woman named Erda, the daughter of a southern chieftain, carved her rune and bled freely across the bone before passing it on without flinching. She returned to her village 2 days later and called for her father's council to resign. Within a year, she ruled in his place. The symbolism of bone and metal was never explained to outsiders. It wasn't a written lore, but a lived one. The forge shaped tools, the feast shaped people. Together, they maintained a balance that the clan believed was older than kingship. After all, a good weapon without wisdom was dangerous, and wisdom without metal was often ignored. In uniting both, the feast offered something rare, an evening where mind and matter sharpened one another. Eventually, the traditions of the feast faded. The central forge was used less often, its rituals kept only by a few old smiths who muttered to themselves while polishing tongs that hadn't touched fire in years. The hall became quieter. Wars grew messier, alliances quicker and colder. The kind of patience the feast required no longer fit in a world rushing toward borders and banners. But still, every few winters, a messenger would arrive in one of the outlying towns, carrying a blade with no name and a sealed pouch of boar fat and ash. No one ever admitted where it came from. But among the old houses, among those who remembered how metal once tasted of truth, the meaning was clear. A feast had been held. A judgment passed. And someone somewhere had carved a bone with a symbol that would never be spoken aloud.